Picture this. It's 1922. You are looking at a brightly colored advertisement for Lipton tea.
Right, the classic one.
Yeah, exactly. In the background, there is this grand, imposing outer wall of an ancient Indian palace. It looks traditional, rooted, really powerful. But in the foreground, sitting tall and incredibly rigid on horseback, is Prince Arthur.
Oh, the Duke of Connaught.
Right, the third son of Queen Victoria. And you have to wonder, what does this single, seemingly random tea advertisement have to do with the foundation of modern Indian history?
A lot more than you'd think.
I mean, if you are a serious student of the subject, and I'm talking directly to you right now, perhaps as you prep for a massive analytical hurdle like the UPSC, this image is the ultimate cheat code.
Oh, absolutely. It really is.
Welcome to this deep dive into the historical sources. Today, we are tearing down the way you think about the past. Our mission is not to just, hand you a timeline of kings and wars and treaties to rote memorize. We are going to deconstruct the very mechanics of when, where, and how history is actually built.
And that 1922 Lipton ad is, well, it's the perfect place to start, because it forces us to rethink what a historical event actually is. I mean, traditionally, history was viewed almost exclusively through the lens of political power.
But just a timeline of when a king was crowned.
Exactly, or when a major battle was fought. But modern historical analysis has dramatically shifted the camera's focus. We are no longer just looking at the battlefield. We are asking how people lived. Like, how did livelihoods change?
Yeah.
How did new cities develop? How did completely new ideas spread? And, how did cultural norms shift?
And that shift in focus completely changes the value we assign to specific dates. Because, and a date on its own is just a number. The year 1922 means absolutely nothing in a vacuum.
It's just a spot on a calendar.
Right. It only becomes vital based on the specific set of events a historian chooses to put in the spotlight. History is like a camera lens. If you only point it at political treaties, you just get a history of dates and deaths.
Yeah.
But point it at this Lipton tea ad, and suddenly you are looking at a history of psychological marketing and economic manipulation. But wait, how does a tea ad actually do that?
Well, the visual composition of that advertisement is, quite frankly, a masterclass in colonial messaging.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah, by placing British royalty right in front of an Indian palace, the creators of the ad were artificially manufacturing a market. They were popularizing a relatively new taste, tea drinking, in this case by associating an everyday commodity with the highest levels of global prestige.
So it's a total power play.
Precisely. The message was implicit, but really loud. To drink this tea is to participate in the royalty and civilization of the British Empire while simultaneously dominating the traditional Indian landscape in the background.
Oh, man. So it is not just about selling a beverage at all. If you are studying the spread of global markets, 1922 is the year a massive cultural and economic shift was being aggressively forced onto the Indian public.
Exactly. The focus dictates the history.
Which brings up an incredibly vital point for anyone studying the mechanics of power. If the focus dictates the history, who gets to decide the categories of time? I mean, who gets to chop up centuries of human existence and just put a label on them?
That is where we really have to look at the people holding the pen. So in 1817, a Scottish economist and political philosopher named James Mill published a massive 3-volume work.
A History of British India, right.
Right. And Mill took it upon himself to categorize the entire timeline of the subcontinent. He divided Indian history into 3 distinct periods: Hindu, Muslim, and British.
Hold on. Calling an entire massive century the Hindu period or the Muslim period, doesn't that completely erase the actual day-to-day lives of millions of people who were just trying to, farm or trade or survive?
It absolutely does.
Labeling complex, diverse eras solely by the religion of the ruling elite just feels like a deliberate, almost malicious oversimplification.
And you're spot on, because the oversimplification served a very specific purpose. Mill's periodization was a foundational piece of colonial justification. By categorizing the pre-British eras strictly by religion, the implication was that India was trapped in a dark age of religious despots, intolerance, caste taboos, and superstitious practices.
I see.
The underlying narrative was that Indian society was inherently divided and backward, and therefore they desperately needed the British to arrive and introduce, quote-unquote, civilization, manners, and law.
It is essentially a retroactive public relations campaign. I mean, you paint the past as a chaotic nightmare, so your present rule looks like a rescue mission.
That is exactly what it was. Now, over time, historians recognized how flawed Mill's religious categories were and moved away from them.
Thankfully.
Yeah, they adopted a Western model of periodization instead.
Yeah.
So they divided Indian history into ancient, medieval, and modern. But uh, when we apply that Western framework to India, the system breaks down completely.
Because the word modern carries a ton of ideological baggage,
I
right?
have it, yes.
When we talk about the modern period in a Western context, we are talking about the growth of science, reason, democracy, liberty, and equality. And medieval is the label used to describe a society where those features just did not exist.
Right. So applying the modern label to the British period in India creates a massive historical paradox.
Because there was nothing modern about how they were treating people.
Exactly. Under British rule, Indians did not have liberty, they did not have equality, and they certainly did not have freedom. There was no glorious economic growth or progress for the Indian masses. To call this period modern, in the Western sense, is to quietly accept the colonial propaganda.
So if it wasn't the shining beacon of modernity and science and liberty, what was actually happening on the ground? Let's strip away the romanticized Victorian language for a second. If we are looking at the stark clinical reality, how do we actually define colonization in a functional way?
Well, we have to define it as a systematic mechanism of extraction.
Extraction, okay.
Yeah. The primary overarching aim of the British was conquering the country and establishing absolute authority. They achieved this by subduing local nawabs and rajas. But military conquest was only step one.
Right, that's just getting in the door?
Exactly. True colonization is the rigid, pervasive control over both the economy and the society.
So walk us through those mechanisms. I mean, how do you weaponize an entire subcontinent's economy?
You start by hijacking the revenue streams. The colonial state collected massive amounts of revenue from the local population.
But I'm guessing they didn't use it to build roads for the locals?
Not at all. That money wasn't reinvested into local infrastructure or public good. It was collected specifically to cover the British administration's own expenses and to fund their military campaigns. Next, you use your political dominance to dictate market prices. They acquired Indian goods like spices and textiles at rock-bottom prices.
They were essentially operating a massive monopoly backed by an army. Buy low by force, sell high globally.
Exactly, but the most devastating mechanism was the disruption of agriculture. They forced Indian farmers to stop growing subsistence crops.
Meaning the food they actually needed to survive.
Right, and instead they had to cultivate specific cash crops that were needed for export to Europe, like indigo or cotton.
Let's pause on that because this is where the human element really comes in for me. What does the mechanism of forcing a crop actually look like for a local farmer? Like, how do you make someone stop growing wheat or rice and grow indigo instead?
It is done through a vicious cycle of debt and coercion. You offer a cultivator an advance, a loan, at a time when they are really desperate. But the condition of that loan is that they must grow indigo on the best part of their land.
Oh, wow. So they take the best soil.
Yes. And then, when a crop is harvested, the price paid to the farmer is kept artificially low, so the loan is never fully paid off. The debt just rolls over the next season.
So they are trapped.
Completely trapped. They can't grow food to feed their family, and the soil quality is destroyed by the deep roots of the cash crop.
And that complete, pervasive takeover that is the true anatomy of colonization. It isn't just a political change on a map where one king replaces another. It is the comprehensive, systemic transformation of values, customs, and daily practices.
It altered the political structure, the economic realities, the social hierarchies, and the cultural fabric of the entire nation.
Wait, so you are talking about a complete economic and social takeover of an incredibly vast and diverse subcontinent? You can't just do that on a whim. How on earth did a handful of British officials actually manage and track a population of millions without computers or digital databases?
They created a paper trail unlike anything the world had ever seen.
Just mountains of paper.
Literally. The British administration operated on a very rigid philosophical belief.
Mm.
Every single instruction, every plan, every policy decision, every minor agreement, and every local investigation had to be written down.
That sounds exhausting.
It was. But this wasn't just a preference. It was an absolute obsession with documentation. It birthed an entire administrative culture built on memos, notings, and reports.
It sounds like they were trying to build a 19th century server farm using paper and ink. And they didn't just write these things down, right? They meticulously preserved them.
Oh, yeah.
Like every single administrative institution, from the lowest village office to the highest levels of government, had a record room attached to it.
They even built massive specialized institutions just to house this ocean of paperwork. The National Archives of India, which was established in the 1920s in New Delhi, is the ultimate testament to this mindset.
The geography of where they put that building is fascinating, by the way. When New Delhi was designed, the National Museum and the National Archives weren't hidden away in some forgotten, dusty corner of the city.
No, they were right in the center.
Exactly. They were placed right next to the Viceregal Palace. It is a physical, architectural manifestation of the idea that information is literally power. By placing the archives next to the seat of ultimate authority, they were telling the world, we rule because we know.
And the physical labor required to maintain this system before the widespread use of the printing press is just staggering. In the early years of the 19th century, these documents were painstakingly copied out by hand.
Really? All of it?
Yes. They were beautifully written by skilled calligraphists, specialists in the art of beautiful writing. Later, as printing spread, multiple copies of these proceedings were printed for every government department. The sheer volume of paper generated was a weapon of empire.
But administrative records, memos, and policy decisions only document what the government itself was actually doing. If their primary goal was to extract maximum revenue, they needed to know exactly what they owned. They couldn't just tax people blindly.
Which leads us to the era of measuring to master. To carry out effective administration and revenue extraction, the British initiated detailed, comprehensive surveys starting in the early 19th century. They went out into the villages and conducted revenue surveys.
To map the property lines, I assume.
They mapped the land boundaries, yes, but they went much deeper than that.
This is where I have to ask, why would a British tax collector care about the local flora and fauna? I mean, shouldn't they just be counting the money and measuring the property lines? Why spend resources mapping soil quality and local cropping histories?
Because you cannot extract maximum wealth if you don't know the capacity of the soil. They mapped the topography, the flora, the fauna, and the cropping patterns to calculate the precise agricultural potential of every single region.
Oh, so it wasn't scientific curiosity at all. They were literally treating the landscape like a massive spreadsheet to optimize an economic engine. If you know exactly what resources grow there, you know exactly how much you can squeeze out of the local population without completely collapsing the system.
Exactly. And that desire to measure, categorize, and document eventually extended from the land to the human beings living on it. By the end of the 19th century, the British introduced a decennial census held every 10 years.
Right, tracking the population.
Yes, it was a massive operation to record the number of people in all provinces. But more importantly, it categorized them. The census noted detailed information on castes, religion, and occupation.
They were putting the entire population into neat little demographic boxes. And it wasn't just people and revenue, right? The sources mention a vast array of other scientific mapping.
Oh, absolutely.
Like botanical surveys, zoological surveys, archaeological surveys, anthropological surveys, and forest surveys. They were dissecting the subcontinent, categorizing every plant, animal, ruin, and person.
But this brings us to an incredibly important, critical question. And this is the exact analytical skill you need when you are reviewing historical texts.
Okay, let's hear it.
The British mapped the soil, they categorized the plants, and they counted the population down to the last individual. They generated a literal mountain of data. What did this massive, highly organized archive completely fail to capture?
Well, that is the blind spot of the state, isn't it? Official records, no matter how detailed or beautifully calligraphed, inherently tell the story from only one perspective.
Precisely. They document what the colonial officials were interested in, and crucially, they document what the state wished to preserve for posterity to see. They record the triumphs, the policies, the revenue collected, and the administrative challenges, but all is seen from the top down.
So when you are sitting in an exam hall and you see a quote from a 19th century British revenue officer, your first instinct shouldn't be to take it as absolute truth.
Never.
Your first instinct needs to be, what is this official trying to hide? What is missing from this page? Because these records utterly ignore the missing masses.
They really do.
You can read 1,000 pages of agricultural surveys, and you will not find a single sentence about the lived reality of the farmer whose land was just mapped. You won't find their feelings, their motivations, their daily struggles, or the reasons behind their actions. The official record is clinically devoid of human empathy.
Therefore, if you are striving to truly understand the fabric of society, you cannot rely solely on the National Archives. The machinery of the empire is in the official records, but the reality of the people is hidden in the margins. To reconstruct the true past, to find the people's perspective, historians have to seek out entirely different sources.
But where do you even find those voices if the state wasn't recording them? I mean, it's not like they had blogs back then.
Well, you look for the diaries of ordinary people. You read the accounts of pilgrims and travelers who are moving through the country and observing life without an administrative agenda. You seek out the autobiographies of local figures.
Oh, so looking at the informal stuff.
Exactly. As printing became more accessible to the public, you look at popular booklets sold in local bazaars, the debates published in the local press, and the writings of poets and novelists expressing the feelings of a nation.
You essentially have to piece together the history of the people from the scraps that the state didn't think were important enough to file away in the viceregal palace. The official records show you the cage, but the unofficial records show you the people living inside it.
That is a great way to put it. The challenge, of course, is that even these unofficial sources have limitations.
Because you had to know how to read and write to create them.
Exactly. The diaries, the booklets, the newspapers, these were largely produced by those who were literate. Reconstructing the history of the tribals, the peasants, the mine workers, or the poor on the streets remains a deeply difficult historical task, requiring even more innovative methods of reading between the lines.
Let's pull all of this together because we have covered a massive amount of ground today. We started by looking at how history is a constructed narrative, not a static list of dates. The dates that matter change based on where we focus our lens. Like zooming in on a 1922 tea advertisement to understand cultural marketing instead of just memorizing the year of a battle.
And we examined how James Mill's 1817 division of Indian history into Hindu, Muslim, and British was a biased timeline, designed to erase the complexity of the masses and justify colonial rule. We recognize that applying Western terms like modern fails entirely when describing the harsh realities of a colonized society that lacked basic liberty and equality.
We stripped down the romantic language of colonization to its bare mechanics, too. A systematic economic and cultural takeover where resources were extracted and farmers were coerced into growing cash crops at the expense of their own survival. And then we explored the British obsession with the paper trail.
Right, creating vast archives of memos and reports to control the narrative, placing the National Archives right next to the seat of power.
We saw how they used revenue surveys and the decennial census not out of scientific curiosity, but to measure and master the land. They treated the subcontinent like a spreadsheet, categorizing everything from flora to caste to optimize extraction.
And finally, we realized that despite this overwhelming mountain of data, official records are inherently flawed. They reflect the perspective of the state, completely hiding the lived experiences, feelings, and motivations of the common people. Every single source must be aggressively questioned.
Which leaves us with a critical thought to ponder as we step away today.
Yeah, and we've spent this time discussing how the official records of the 19th century systematically ignored the realities of the common people, forcing historians to look for diaries and local pamphlets. Think about our digital world right now.
Oh man, that is an interesting parallel.
Right. 200 years from now, historians will look back at our current era. If they only have access to official government data, corporate press releases, and the algorithmic data points harvested by massive tech companies, what will they see?
A very skewed picture.
Exactly. If official records are built to serve the state and the powerful, think about the digital footprint you are leaving behind. Will future historians judge our era by our highly curated social media feeds? Or will the vital, messy human truths of your life only be found in the private, deleted drafts you never posted?
That's haunting. If we aren't careful about preserving our own messy realities, someone else's algorithm will write our history. Keep questioning the narrative, keep looking beyond the official records, and keep pointing your lens at the things the powerful want you to ignore. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. Until next time, remember that history is always happening, and it's never as simple as the dates on a page.
Imagine, just for a second, a modern, massive tech conglomerate, like, one of those trillion-dollar multinational corporations.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. So now imagine them slowly buying up land in a foreign country. They build this heavily fortified corporate campus, and they actually raise their own private army of security contractors.
Which, sounds completely absurd today.
Totally absurd. And then, piece by piece, using legal loopholes, bribery, outright violence, they just take over the government of that entire region. It sounds like, a script for a dystopian sci-fi movie.
It really does, but the wild thing is this isn't fiction at all.
No, it's not. This is exactly what happened in India between 1600 and 1857.
Yeah, it really is one of the most astonishing and frankly chilling takeovers in human history. I mean, a group of merchants operating out of warehouses essentially swallowed a subcontinent.
And that is exactly what we are getting into today. We're taking a deep dive into a really fascinating stack of historical accounts, company charters, and economic records from this era.
Right, because there's so much material to unpack here.
Exactly. And our mission for you today, listening to this, is to move past the dry timeline of battles and dates. We want to uncover the why behind all these events. Because this wasn't just about, military might.
No, not at all. It was really a masterclass in diplomacy, administrative manipulation, and just pure corporate overreach.
To really understand how this happened, though, I think we have to look at the world they were operating in. So let's set the stage in the year 1707.
Right. So 1707, the last truly powerful Mughal ruler, Aurangzeb, has just died. And for generations, the Mughal Empire had a firm, centralized grip on a massive part of Indian territory.
But with his death, that grip rapidly weakened.
Exactly. It just starts to fracture.
Now, if you're listening to this and wondering, why didn't the Mughals just crush these European merchants immediately? We really need to remember the global economic context here. I mean, India wasn't some struggling, empty region. At this time, it was practically the factory of the world, right?
Oh, absolutely. That is a crucial point. India and China were producing, honestly, the vast majority of the world's GDP. The wealth was staggering.
Wow.
But politically, after 1707, this massive power vacuum opens up. You suddenly have all these regional governors and influential large landowners.
The zamindars.
Right, the zamindars. They start asserting their own authority. They're carving out powerful regional kingdoms, and the central authority in Delhi becomes largely ineffective.
So it's basically fragmenting from the inside.
Exactly. And this internal fragmentation happens at the exact same moment that European trading companies are desperately scouring the globe for new markets.
So how does a British corporation end up right in the middle of this fractured superpower?
Well, it starts with the Royal Charter of 1600. Queen Elizabeth III basically hands the East India Company the ultimate golden ticket, which is the sole exclusive right to trade in the East.
Meaning no other English company could compete with them.
Right, a total monopoly for the English. But we really need to understand the underlying philosophy driving them. This was the era of the mercantile mindset.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. What does a mercantile operation actually look like on the ground?
So a mercantile enterprise, they don't really care about governing or, building infrastructure or advancing a nation. It exists solely to make massive profits, primarily through trade. And trade was very much a zero-sum game back then.
Meaning one side wins, the other loses.
Exactly. The formula was brutal, but simple. Buy goods in India as cheaply as possible, things like fine cotton, silk, pepper, cloves, and then sell them at a massive premium back in Europe.
But they weren't walking into an empty market, obviously. The Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, they were all already there, and they all wanted the exact same spices and textiles.
Yeah, and that intense competition inevitably drove the prices of those goods up in India, which, slashed the profit margins for the European companies.
Which they obviously hated.
Oh, they couldn't stand it. This wasn't some friendly free market. When diplomacy failed, these trading companies fiercely clashed. I mean, they sank each other's ships, they blockaded trade routes. Trade and warfare became completely intertwined.
Well, essentially couldn't be a merchant without also being a heavily armed mercenary.
You really couldn't. So to protect themselves, they had to establish a physical footprint. The records show that by 1651, the English set up their first settlement on the banks of the Hooghly River in Bengal.
Right. But they called it a factory.
Yeah.
And I think when we hear that today, we immediately picture, smokestacks and assembly lines, but that wasn't it at all.
No, not at all. A factory back then was simply a base of operations for their traders, who were officially known as factors.
Hence the name.
Exactly. It was a warehouse, an accounting office, and a residential compound just rolled into one.
It's just so modern when you think about it. It's like, going back to that analogy, a tech company building a walled campus overseas. They start with a warehouse. Then they convince local merchants to settle around it for convenience.
And then, of course, they decide they need security.
Right. So by 1696, they literally build a fort around their settlement. They even start acquiring zamindari rights, like tax collection rights, over 3 local villages. And one of those would eventually become the city of Kolkata.
Yeah, you can really see how the lines between a private business and a sovereign state are already blurring here. The company even managed to persuade the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb to issue a farman.
Which is like a royal edict, right?
Right, a royal decree granting them the right to trade completely duty-free.
Hold on, let me make sure I'm getting this right. Why on earth would Aurangzeb give a foreign corporation a massive tax break? I mean, that seems like a terrible deal for the Mughal Empire.
In hindsight, it was a fatal miscalculation. But from the perspective of this massive land-based empire with vast agrarian wealth, these European naval merchants seemed honestly relatively insignificant.
Just a drop in the bucket.
Exactly. The Mughals thought they were just encouraging useful traders who brought in foreign silver. They just didn't see the long-term threat.
But, give a corporation an inch, and they take a mile. Because the duty-free right was only meant for the company's official trade. But the company officials themselves were severely underpaid.
Right. Their official salaries were tiny.
So they were running their own private side hustles, smuggling goods, and refusing to pay taxes on their personal trade. They were openly bleeding the local economy dry.
Which naturally infuriated the local rulers. I mean, Bengal had some incredibly capable Nawabs during this time. You've got Murshid Quali Khan, Alavardi Khan, and Sirajudaulah.
And they weren't going to just sit back and watch this happen.
Exactly. They weren't going to watch a foreign corporation strip their province of revenue. So they demanded tributes, they stopped the company from minting its own coins, and they ordered them to halt their military fortifications.
So the Nawabs were basically looking at them saying, you are merchants, act like merchants, stop building military bases.
But the company has already tasted the profits of tax evasion. They just can't back down without losing everything.
So how does that tension actually break? I mean, it has to snap eventually.
It boils over in 1757. Nawab Sirajudaulah has finally had enough of the disrespect, so he marches 30,000 soldiers to take the English factory at Qasim Bazar.
30,000, wow.
Yeah, it was a massive force. He locks up the company officials, disarms them, blockades the British ships, and then marches on Calcutta to take control of their fort.
Okay, so the Nawab makes a massive show of force. The company must be in full panic mode at this point.
Oh, absolutely.
I know they have a commander named Robert Clive down from Madras with an army to take back control, which leads to the famous Battle of Plassey. But if Clive is facing down 30,000 troops, how does he not get completely wiped off the map? Like, what's his strategy?
Well, the strategy was that there wasn't really much of a battle at all. Plassey wasn't won through grand British military genius. It was won in the shadows through corporate bribery.
Really? Just bought them off.
Basically, Clive realized his small force couldn't beat the Nawab's massive army in a fair fight, so he orchestrated a backroom deal. He approached Mir Jafar, who was one of the Nawab's key military commanders, and Clive promised to install Mir Jafar as the new Nawab if he betrayed Sirajudaulah.
Wow. So when the battle starts, the commander of the army just stands down.
Mir Jafar's forces never even entered the fray. Sirajudaulah was defeated and killed. But this moment, this is key, it taught the East India Company a terrifyingly effective lesson. They realized they didn't actually need to conquer territories outright if they could just install compliant rulers.
Ah, so this is the era of the puppet Nawabs.
Yes, exactly. At this stage, the company didn't actually want the headache of day-to-day administration. They just wanted zero interruptions to their profit margins.
Right, keep the money flowing.
So a puppet Nawab, controlled by strings pulled from Calcutta, was the perfect solution. You give the local ruler the illusion of a crown, while the company holds all the actual power and just drains the wealth.
But even puppets have a breaking point, right? Because when you read the sources, these installed Nawabs eventually try to assert some dignity because their own subjects are literally starving.
Right, they tried to push back. And the company deposes them, fights another battle at Buxar in 1764, and then realizes the puppet system is actually too volatile.
Which brings us to 1765. And this is arguably an even bigger turning point than Plassey. The Mughal emperor, who is now severely weakened, is forced to appoint the East India Company as the Dewan of Bengal.
Yes, the Diwani rights.
For anyone listening who wants the ultimate aha moment of how India was economically gutted, this is the mechanism. But what exactly does being the Dewan mean in practice?
So, the Diwani right gave the company the legal authority to collect all the land revenue of the vast, wealthy province of Bengal.
Okay.
And before 1765, the company had a major financial problem. Britain wasn't producing much that India actually wanted to buy, so the company had to buy Indian cotton and silk using gold and silver imported all the way from Europe.
Right, a massive trade deficit.
Exactly. But the Diwani flipped the script entirely. Suddenly, the company was using India's own tax money to buy Indian goods for export.
Oh my God.
Yeah, they used Indian revenue to fund their trade, to pay their private armies, and to build their forts. They were no longer bringing wealth into India. They were extracting it on a colossal scale.
It's just the ultimate corporate buyout, funded entirely by the company you're buying.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And the individuals running this operation, I mean, the wealth they amassed was obscene. These company officials would return to England with unimaginable fortunes, buy massive estates, purchase seats in Parliament. The British public actually mocks them, didn't they?
They did. They called them nabobs, which was an anglicized, somewhat sneering version of the Indian word nawab.
Right, like new money.
Exactly. It highlighted how these ordinary, sometimes low-born merchants had suddenly elevated themselves to the status of Oriental royalty through sheer exploitation.
Okay, so the company has Bengal. Their pockets are lined with Indian tax money. But, taking over one province is very different from taking over an entire subcontinent.
Very different.
And fighting wars constantly is incredibly expensive and terrible for the company's stock price back in London. So how did they expand their reach without fighting a pitched battle for every single square inch?
This is where we see their strategic evolution. Between 1757 and 1857, the company heavily favored covert diplomatic tools over direct military confrontation whenever possible. And their most potent weapon was the appointment of residents.
Residents. I mean, that sounds like a polite diplomatic envoy, like an ambassador.
Officially, yeah, they were there to advance trade and maintain friendly relations, but unofficially, they were shadow governors and spies.
Of course.
They were deeply meddling in the internal affairs of the sovereign states. They dictated who would succeed to the throne, who got administrative posts. They were actively destabilizing these courts from the inside.
And their absolute masterpiece of shady diplomacy was something called the subsidiary alliance. When I was looking through the mechanics of this, I was trying to figure out a good analogy.
Let's hear it.
Okay, let me make sure I'm getting this right. You're a sovereign king. The company comes to you and says, hey, disband your army, we'll protect you. Then they charge you a massive fee for that protection. It essentially sounds like a mafia protection racket.
Honestly, that is a highly accurate way to describe the mechanism. Pushed aggressively by Governor General Richard Wellesley around 1798, the subsidiary alliance was brilliantly sinister.
How did it work, step by step?
Step 1. An Indian ruler is forced to disband their own independent armed forces. They completely lose their ability to defend themselves.
And step 2 is the company moves their own troops in.
Yes, and these troops were often stationed right in the ruler's capital, effectively holding them hostage. Then, step 3. The Indian ruler has to pay the company for the maintenance of these troops.
Which they probably couldn't afford.
Often they couldn't. And if the ruler fails to make the exorbitant payment,
The company seizes a chunk of their territory as a penalty.
that's the trap. It was a debt cycle perfectly designed to end in territorial annexation. The Nawab of Awadh, for example, was forced to hand over more than half of his entire kingdom to the company in 1801 simply because he couldn't afford the bill for this forced protection.
Half his kingdom, just gone.
Yep. Hyderabad suffered a similar fate. They lost their sovereignty without a single musket being fired.
It's incredibly dark. You create the threat, you sell the protection, and when they inevitably default, you just take the house.
Exactly.
But surely not every ruler just signed on the dotted line. Someone had to look at this paperwork trap and realize it was a death sentence. What happened when rulers actively fought back?
Well, when a ruler refused to play the game and directly threatened the company's commercial interests, the British absolutely resorted to brutal military force. The most famous example of this resistance in the South is the Kingdom of Mysore.
Right, Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore. What was his strategy against them?
So Mysore had grown incredibly strong under Hyder Ali and his son, Tipu Sultan. They controlled the highly lucrative spice trade on the Malabar coast.
Okay.
In 1785, Tipu Sultan hit the company where it hurt most. He completely stopped the export of sandalwood, pepper, and cardamom through his courts. He banned local merchants from trading with them.
An economic embargo. He's basically using their own mercantile tactics against them.
Exactly. And he coupled that economic warfare with brilliant geopolitics. Tipu Sultan had established a close relationship with the French, which was Britain's greatest global rival.
Oh, that's bold.
Very. With French help, he was rapidly modernizing his army, adopting European military tactics and weaponry. He despised the British. There's actually this famous artifact from his court, a life-size mechanical wooden tiger designed to look like it's mauling a British soldier.
Wait, really? A mechanical tiger?
Yes, complete with a built-in organ that simulates the soldier's screams.
That is intensely personal. I mean, he wasn't just a local ruler. He was a modernized threat aligning with their worst enemy.
Exactly. The British saw him as arrogant, dangerous, and an existential threat that simply had to be crushed. It took 4 devastating Anglo-Mysore wars. Finally, in 1799, at the Battle of Seringapatam, Tipu Sultan was killed defending his capital.
Wow. And then what happened to Mysore?
The company then installed the old Wudiyar dynasty as puppet rulers and, predictably, slapped a subsidiary alliance right on them.
So they eliminate the threat and put the mafia protection racket right back in place.
You got it.
But Mysore wasn't the only massive power. I've read the Marathas controlled a vast portion of the subcontinent. How do you take down an empire that big?
The Maratha story is fascinating because it shows how the company exploited internal divisions. The Marathas were once the most formidable power in India, but they suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Third Battle of Panipat in 1761.
Which fractured their empire, right?
Completely. They broke into multiple regional states led by different dynasties. You had the Scindias, Holkars, Gaikwads.
And were they unified at all?
Well, they were supposed to be held together under the Peshwa and Poon, but the East India Company played these factions against each other brilliantly. They would ally with one against another, wearing them all down through a series of Anglo-Maratha wars.
Divide and conquer.
Precisely. By 1819, the company had crushed Maratha power completely, removed the Peshwa, and basically exiled him with a pension.
It's wild. We've gone from humble merchants to shadow puppeteers, to mafia bosses, to military conquerors. By the early 19th century, at what point did they just drop the act? I mean, they clearly aren't pretending to be equal allies anymore.
Yeah, this is where we see a massive psychological shift. Under Lord Hastings, the company introduced this policy of paramountcy.
Paramountcy, so they just declare themselves the supreme authority.
Right.
But by what right?
By the right of overwhelming unchecked power. The company openly declared that its authority was paramount or supreme above any Indian state.
Well, just claiming it.
Yeah, therefore, it claimed the moral and legal justification to annex or threaten any Indian kingdom if it served the company's interests. We see rulers like Rani Channama of Kittur led armed resistances against this, but the colonial machine just pushes forward.
And if paramountcy was the blunt instrument, what Governor General Lord Dalhousie brought in a few decades later was the scalpel, right? The doctrine of lapse.
Oh, absolutely. The doctrine of lapse is the ultimate bureaucratic weapon of colonialism.
How did that work?
Implemented between 1848 and 1856, the rule was deceptively simple. If an Indian ruler died without a biological male heir, his kingdom would lapse and automatically be absorbed into company territory.
I was trying to think of an analogy for this earlier. It's not like a bank foreclosing on a house. It's more like if you built a company your whole life and the corporate board of directors secretly passes a new bylaw saying, hey, if you don't have a biological son, your shares default to us when you die.
That's exactly what it felt like. Because for centuries, Indian rulers without biological sons had the deeply respected, recognized right to adopt an heir to inherit the throne. Dalhousie just erased that ancient tradition with a pen stroke.
And what's fascinating here is the sheer administrative violence of it. They didn't need to mobilize armies to take over major states like Satara, Sambalpur, Udaipur, Nagpur, and Jhansi.
Right. They just waited for a king to die, looked at the paperwork, denied the adopted heir's legitimacy, and swallowed the state whole.
But how did they actually enforce that? How do you just declare a kingdom yours without sparking immediate, massive rebellions every single time?
Because by this point, the local populations were largely disarmed, their traditional leadership was fractured, and the East India Company had a massive looming military presence backing up their bureaucrats.
Which brings us to the actual machinery of the empire. I mean, conquering territory, whether by the sword or the pen, is only half the battle. You actually have to administer it. You have to extract the taxes efficiently to keep the shareholders back in London happy.
Exactly. And Warren Hastings played a massive role in creating this colonial administration.
Yeah.
He divided the territories into administrative units called presidencies: Bengal, Madras, and Bombay.
Right.
He overhauled the justice system, setting up a criminal court and a civil court in every district. But the real power, the true anchor of their control, was vested in a brand new office: the collector.
The collectorate.
Right. The collector's main job was to collect revenue and taxes and maintain law and order. By establishing the collectorate, the British systematically stripped the traditional local elites like the zamindars and village headmen of their historic authority.
So they're completely bypassing the existing social structures.
Exactly. They were rewiring the very DNA of Indian society, placing their own administrators at the absolute center of power in rural India.
But to enforce the collector's will, to fight their wars of expansion against Tipu Sultan and the Marathas, they needed an army. And they didn't ship hundreds of thousands of British soldiers over. They built the sepoy army. And this is the part that always confuses me. Why would Indian peasants join a British corporate army to oppress other Indian kingdoms? Like, what was the incentive there?
It really comes down to socioeconomics and the changing nature of warfare. The traditional Mughal military relied heavily on cavalry, elites on horseback.
Right.
But the British needed professional infantry, foot soldiers armed with modern muskets. At the same time, traditional agrarian economies were being completely disrupted by these new land policies.
So people are out of work.
Exactly. So the company went to the peasants and offered something revolutionary: a regular salary paid in cash, strict discipline, and a pension.
Wow, so they treated the military like a corporate payroll.
Very much so. Traditional kings often paid irregularly or in grain, but the company offered stability. Furthermore, we have to remember that India, as a unified national identity, just didn't exist yet.
Ah, that makes sense.
A peasant recruited in Bengal felt absolutely no nationalistic loyalty to a Maratha king or the Sultan of Mysore. They were simply taking a reliable job. They were put in British uniforms, trained in European drills, and called sepoys, which comes from sipahi, the Indian word for soldier.
So the company was using Indian taxes to pay Indian recruits to subjugate Indian kingdoms.
It's devastatingly effective.
It is the perfect, terrifyingly self-sustaining machine of conquest.
And the results of that machine really speak for themselves.
They really do. The statistics are just mind-blowing. By 1857, which was accelerated by the invention of steam technology that cut travel time from Europe down to just a few weeks, the East India Company, again, a private corporation, controlled 63% of the territory and 78% of the population, the entire Indian subcontinent.
It's staggering. And if we connect this to the bigger picture for you listening, this history provides a profound lesson in the true anatomy of power. True, lasting subjugation doesn't always announce itself with a massive invading army. The East India Company proved that if you control a region's economics and you dominate its administration, the territory naturally follows.
It starts with a humble request to build a warehouse by the river.
Right.
It's followed by a trade agreement, then a treaty guaranteeing protection, and it's ultimately sealed with bureaucratic paperwork and relentless tax collection.
It's a terrifying masterclass in corporate overreach turning into total empire.
It really is. Which leaves us with a lingering thought for you to mull over today. If a single corporation, driven entirely by profit margins, could leverage commercial contracts, private security forces, and localized treaties to swallow an entire subcontinent 250 years ago, what is stopping a massive, modern, multinational tech or military contracting conglomerate from doing something eerily similar in our highly privatized digital age today?
That is exactly the kind of question history demands we ask.
Thanks for taking the plunge with us. We'll see you on the next deep dive. So picture this, right? You've got this wealthy aristocrat in 18th century Bengal. He's standing on the balcony of his ancestral mansion, and he's just sweating as he watches the sun slowly sink toward the horizon.
Because the absolute second that sun dips out of sight, his entire kingdom is legally gone, just wiped out and sold to the highest bidder by a foreign corporation.
Exactly. I mean, usually when we talk about corporate history, there is this, expectation of boardrooms, spreadsheets, maybe some aggressive mergers. It feels very distant and contained.
Yeah, it's usually confined to the financial pages, safely tucked away from the messy realities of daily life. But when you step into the world of 18th and 19th century India, that corporate history just spills out across an entire subcontinent.
Right. Which is why we are here today.
Oh,
Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. Our mission today is to unpeel the layers of a historical era that's often categorized under colonialism and the countryside.
and we are moving way beyond just, memorizing historical dates for an exam. What we are analyzing today is the absolute definition of a hostile takeover.
A hostile takeover executed on a civilizational scale by the British East India Company. We have a really formidable stack of historical analysis and sources here, and we are going to look at the precise mechanisms they used to radically re-engineer the socio-economic fabric of rural India.
It is genuinely fascinating because for you listening, this is the actual blueprint of how global economic extraction works on the ground.
Yeah, we are talking about global supply chain shocks, fierce grassroots resistance, and the systematic construction of a devastating debt trap. So to understand the architecture of that trap, where do we start?
We really have to look at the pivot point, which is the year 1765. That is when the East India Company acquires the Diwani of Bengal.
Okay, so in practical terms, a group of foreign merchants suddenly became the official administrators, right? Like the tax collectors for one of the richest provinces in the world.
Exactly. And up until this point, they were essentially just a massive trading fleet.
Right, bringing gold and silver bullion from Britain, sailing it all the way around the Cape of Good Hope. And they were using it to buy Indian silk, cotton, and spices. So exactly how did becoming the tax collector change that dynamic?
Well, it completely inverted the global trade balance. Once they held the Diwani, they no longer needed to import British gold at all.
Wait, really? So they just stopped bringing in their own money entirely?
Pretty much. They simply used Bengal's own internal tax revenue to fund their external purchases. They squeezed the local peasants for taxes, then used that exact same money to buy goods from local artisans at wildly depressed prices.
Wow. And then they exported those goods for pure profit. They were effectively using India's money to buy India's goods.
Right. It was a terrifyingly efficient closed loop of extraction.
And the human cost must have been immediate, right? If you
Yeah.
suddenly pull all the capital out of a functioning local economy and force artisans to sell below the cost of production, you just strip away every ounce of resilience that society has.
You do, which is exactly why, when a natural drought hit just a few years later, the society completely collapsed.
Are you talking about the Bengal famine of 1770?
Yes, it wiped out roughly a third of the population. Millions perished simply because the economic shock absorbers had been entirely dismantled by corporate extraction.
It's just bleak. But, I mean, dead peasants don't pay taxes, right? So this must have created an administrative crisis for the company. They still needed a steady, predictable income stream to fund their ongoing military conquests.
They did, and that administrative panic leads directly to their grand experiment in 1793. It was introduced by Lord Cornwallis, and it was called the Permanent Settlement.
Okay, the permanent settlement. What was the actual deal there?
Well, the British decided to designate the local Rajas and Talukars as zemindars. Now, they weren't landowners in the modern sense. The company essentially transformed them into state revenue collectors.
Got it. So the deal was, your estate owes us a fixed massive amount of money every single year, in perpetuity. You extract the rent from the peasantry, keep a tiny fraction for yourself, and hand the rest to us.
Exactly. And the mechanism enforcing this is the famous Sunset Law.
The Sunset Law.
Uh,
This is where my earlier image of the aristocrat on the balcony comes from.
yes, it was like a merciless modern bank foreclosure, but with a literal countdown clock tied to the sun. If the zamindar failed to deliver the exact amount of revenue by sunset on a specified date, the company just seized the estate and auctioned it off.
That is intense. And I read that the company set the initial revenue demands impossibly high, right? What was their logic there?
Their logic was that since the tax rate was fixed forever, they needed to squeeze out the maximum possible amount immediately. They basically assumed agricultural yields would just magically improve over time.
But they didn't. I mean, the 1790s saw deeply depressed agricultural prices. The riots, the peasants, simply couldn't generate enough cash to pay the zamindars.
Right, and consequently, the zamindars couldn't pay the company. So the sun sets, and the estate goes to the auction block.
Our sources note that over 75% of zamindars in Bengal changed hands during this period. But reading through these accounts, it wasn't just a straightforward transfer of wealth, was it?
Not at all. Take the 1797 auction in Burdwan, for example. On paper, it looks like the total collapse of the local Raja's empire. But in reality, it was a masterclass in exploiting legal loopholes.
I love this part. How did the Raja manage to hold onto his power while seemingly losing everything? It sounds like an 18th century corporate shell game.
It really was. Traditional power structures are remarkably adaptable. The Raja of Burdwan was facing catastrophic default, and his lands were being auctioned off piece by piece.
But the highest bidders at these public auctions were often his own servants, right?
Exactly. His own agents would show up, outbid all the legitimate buyers, and secure the land. But then, when it came time to actually hand over the cash to the company, they would simply refuse to pay.
Forcing the company to run the auction all over again.
Over and over. Fictitious sales. The Raja's agents would buy it, default, and force a re-auction.
Just repeating this exhausting bureaucratic cycle.
Right, until the company officials were so desperate to recover any money at all that they would sell the estate back to the Raja's proxies at a massively reduced rock-bottom price.
That is brilliant. And didn't he also use Benami transactions, transferring large portions of his estate into the name of his mother?
He did. He was exploiting a specific company regulation that prohibited the seizure of property owned by women. So it proves the zamindars weren't just passive victims rolling over for the British legal system.
They were actively subverting it from the inside. But, I mean, even with these clever survival tactics, the constant pressure of the permanent settlement and the endless litigation had to take a toll on their local authority.
Oh, absolutely. It created a massive power vacuum in the countryside. The zamindars were bleeding resources trying to navigate the colonial courts.
And political nature abhors a vacuum. So into this void stepped a newly empowered class of rich peasants, known as the Jotedars.
Yes, the Jotedars.
Wait, I have to ask. If the zamindars had the official British backing, the legal titles, and the historical prestige, how does a local peasant end up bossing them around? That doesn't make logical sense on paper.
It makes perfect sense when you look at geography and leverage, you know. The zamindars increasingly lived in urban centers like Calcutta. They were absentee landlords residing in distant mansions.
Ah, okay, while the Jotedars were embedded directly in the villages.
Exactly. In places like Dinajpur in North Bengal, these Jotedars accumulated vast tracts of land. But their power wasn't just in farming. They controlled the sharecroppers, known as atayers.
Right, the ayers who brought their own plows and had to hand over half their yield to the Jotedar. And I imagine the Jotedars also controlled the local trade networks and the village money lending.
They absolutely did. The Jotedar was the actual economic engine of the village.
So if you are a poor Ryat, the zamindar is just this terrifying signature on a piece of paper who demands rent once a year. But the Jotedar is the guy you see every single day.
Exactly. He buys your crops, he employs your family, and he is the one holding the loan that bought your seeds. So when the zamindars' officials finally arrived to collect rent, the Jotedars actively sabotaged them.
They deliberately withheld their own payments and encouraged the poorer Ryats to default as well, right?
Yeah. And if the zamindar tried to use force, the Jotedars didn't rely on the courts. They unleashed their own strongmen, the Lathials.
Men armed with lathis, heavy bamboo sticks. So this wasn't just a legal dispute, it was physical, street-level muscle undermining the colonial tax collection system.
Right. The Jotedar operates almost like a parallel government in the village. This grassroots dynamic completely flips our understanding of rural power.
It really does. But we only grasp the nuances of this struggle because of how meticulously the British documented their own frustrations. Which brings us to a monumental piece of historical evidence, the Fifth Report of 1813.
Yes, over 1,000 pages submitted directly to the British Parliament.
A massive data dump of petitions, revenue statistics, and administrative notes. And for over a century, historians treated this document as the definitive truth of the zamindari collapse.
They did. But diving into the analysis here, there is a massive red flag regarding the motive behind this report. We can never take colonial primary sources at face value, especially political ones.
So what was the real agenda there?
Well, the Fifth Report was commissioned by a select committee in Parliament that was fiercely critical of the East India Company's monopoly. They desperately wanted to prove that the company was mismanaging the Indian administration.
Right, so that Parliament could justify stepping in and regulating them.
Exactly. Therefore, the authors deliberately exaggerated the administrative chaos and the financial ruin of the zamindars to make the company look deeply incompetent.
So it is basically a politically motivated hit piece, dressed up as objective 1,000-page data. The Zamindars were actually surviving much more robustly through those fictitious sales than the report claimed.
Precisely. But this whole Bengal situation presented a long-term financial dead end for the British anyway.
Because they had fixed the revenue permanently in 1793. So when agricultural prices finally started rising in the 19th century, the Jotedars and the Zamindars captured that extra profit.
Yeah, the company didn't see an additional dime, and the British administration was furious about missing out on those profits.
So what did they do?
As they expanded their empire into new territories, like the Bombay Deccan, they completely abandoned the permanent settlement. They pivoted to a new model, the Rayatwari system.
Right, the Rayatwari system.
Yeah.
Instead of dealing with intermediaries like Zamindars, the colonial state decided to extract revenue directly from the Rayat, the individual peasant cultivator.
Exactly. They assessed the soil quality, calculated the average yield, and demanded a massive cut of the income, with the crucial detail that this rate would be reassessed and raised every 30 years.
To me, this transition feels incredibly modern and, honestly, terrifying. It is like taking a workforce that had the flawed but existent buffer of a salary job and suddenly turning them all into independent gig workers.
That is a really good way to look at it.
They are now exposed directly to the extreme volatility of global markets with absolutely no local safety net.
And that vulnerability was about to be hit by a global shockwave. In the early 1860s, the American Civil War erupts. The Union blockades the Confederate ports.
Suddenly, the massive cotton mills in Britain, which relied almost entirely on American cotton, are just starving for raw material. Panic grips the British industrial sector.
Right, so the global supply chain has to pivot instantly, and Britain looks to its sprawling new Indian territories to fill the void.
Almost overnight, the Bombay Deccan was transformed into the primary supplier of cotton to the British Empire.
Yeah, by 1862, India was providing a staggering 90% of Britain's cotton imports. It was a feverish boom.
On the ground in the Deccan, this must have felt like an economic miracle at first, right? Global capital just flooding into these rural villages.
It did. British merchants in Bombay were desperate for cotton, so they handed out massive advances to the rural moneylenders, known as the sahukars.
And these sahukars, flush with British cash, just threw easy, long-term credit at the riots.
They essentially begged the peasants to expand their cotton acreage.
But history tells us that economic booms driven by distant external wars are incredibly fragile. In 1865, the American Civil War ends.
American cotton floods back into the global market, and the price of Indian cotton crashes spectacularly. The gig worker is left holding the bag.
The flow of global credit evaporated overnight. The Sahukars suddenly stopped lending entirely and began aggressively demanding repayment for the massive loans the riots had taken on.
And to make matters worse, the timing was catastrophic. Right as the riots' income collapsed to zero, the British government decided it was time for their 30-year reassessment of the Rayatwari system.
You literally could not design a more perfect storm for human suffering. The British drastically increased the land revenue tax precisely when the peasants had no income.
So the Rayat has absolutely no choice but to go back to the Sahukar to borrow more money just to pay the colonial tax collector and avoid losing their land.
But the rules of engagement with the moneylenders had completely changed under the British legal system, hadn't they?
They had. Before colonial rule, village moneylending was governed by strict, customary norms. There was a vital social safety valve. The interest charged on a loan could never legally exceed the principal amount.
But the British courts completely ignored these local customs, enforcing contracts to the letter regardless of how exploitative they were.
Exactly. The Sahukars weaponized this new legal reality.
How exactly did they manipulate the system against people who largely couldn't read the contracts they were signing?
The mechanics of the fraud were relentless. Sahukars would force illiterate riots to sign blank bonds or put their thumbprints on documents where the figures had been wildly inflated.
They compounded interest daily.
Right, yeah. And when a peasant managed to make a repayment, the Sahukar would simply refuse to issue a receipt, later claiming in a British court that the payment never happened.
The riots weren't just experiencing a bad harvest, they were trapped in a labyrinth of systemic legal injustice, which inevitably boils over.
It did. In 1875, we see the outbreak of the Rayat Rebellion in the Deccan.
And what is brilliant about analyzing the mechanics of this uprising is looking at their targets. They didn't initially march on the heavily armed British forts.
No, they executed surgical strikes against the instruments of their debt trap. They marched into the villages, targeted the sahukars, demanded the debt bonds, and burned the bahikatas.
The bahikatas, the account books, just burned in the public squares. It was direct, logical economic retaliation against the immediate source of their oppression.
The British were deeply alarmed by the scale of it and responded with heavy military force. But the unrest in the Deccan was just one front in a much larger war of extraction.
Right, because the colonial revenue machine didn't just chew up settled farmers. As the company demanded more agricultural land, their expansion fundamentally threatened indigenous communities that had lived outside the traditional agrarian system for centuries.
Which brings us to the tragedy of the Santhals and the forests of the Rajmahal Hills.
Looking at the timeline in our sources, there is a sequence of events that requires explanation. In 1832, the British actively set aside a massive, newly demarcated territory specifically for the Santhals.
Yes, it was called Dominico.
Right. But why would a ruthlessly profit-driven colonial power carve out what looks like a special sanctuary for an indigenous group, only to brutally exploit them a decade later?
Well, we have to view Dominico not as a sanctuary, but as an agricultural factory in the making. The British looked at the dense forests of the Rajmahal Hills and saw wasted revenue.
Ah, and the original inhabitants of those hills, the Paharias, they practiced shifting cultivation, right?
Exactly. They moved constantly, hunting and gathering, and fiercely resisted settled farming. The British considered them savage, uncontrollable, and most importantly, untaxable.
They needed a different labor force to clear the woods, so they invite the Santhals in to do the heavy lifting.
The Santhals were skilled at clearing forests and willing to plow the land, so the British created Dominico as an incentive.
The promise was simple: settle here, clear the forest, transition to growing cash crops, and this territory belongs to you.
Right. The Santhals gave up their ancient nomadic heritage and embraced a settled agrarian life, and they were spectacularly successful at it.
The Santhal population in that specific area exploded from roughly 3,000 in 1838 to over 82,000 by 1851. But the moment that land becomes highly productive, the jaws of the colonial trap snap shut.
Exactly as designed. Once the forests were cleared and producing valuable crops, the colonial state immediately imposed heavy taxes,
And riding the coattails of the tax collectors came the moneylenders.
whom the Santhals called the Daikas, the outsiders. These Daikas charged extortionate interest rates, operating the exact same debt mechanisms we saw in the Deccan.
Within a few years, the Santhals realized that the permanent homeland they had literally carved out of the wilderness with their bare hands was being legally stolen from them.
Which gives the Santhal Rebellion of 1855 and 1856 such profound cultural weight. This wasn't just a grievance over a percentage point on a tax form.
It was an existential defense of a new identity they had forged. Led by charismatic figures like Sidhu Manji, the rebellion was a heroic, desperate fight.
It really was. The historical accounts describe tens of thousands of Santhals mobilizing. You have these striking, tragic images of indigenous warriors armed only with bows, arrows, and axes charging into the musket fire and artillery of fully uniformed British sepoys.
The British response was overwhelming, wasn't it? Burning entire villages, declaring martial law, and deploying massive military columns to crush the uprising.
Yes. Yet the resistance was so fierce that it forced the British to alter their administrative map, carving out a special Santhal Pargana, hoping that a slightly adjusted bureaucratic framework would pacify the region.
It is a grim cycle. Extract until the population breaks. Crush the resulting rebellion with military force. Slightly adjust the paperwork and continue extracting.
And the cycle wasn't just applied to land tenure, it was applied to the crops themselves.
Right. Alongside heavy taxation, the British began forcing peasants to cultivate specific cash crops for the global market. And nothing represents the sheer tyranny of this system quite like indigo in Bengal.
The indigo system was a masterclass in coercion. European planters needed indigo to dye the textiles pouring out of British factories. But growing indigo exhausted the soil rapidly.
Meaning peasants couldn't grow rice to feed their own family.
Exactly. So the planters used the Dudon system. They forced ryots to accept a small cash advance to grow indigo.
Once a riot accepted that advance, the contract was written so that it could never realistically be paid off, right?
Yep. They were paid a fraction of the market price. And if a riot tried to refuse the advance, the European planters unleashed their own private armies of Lathials and Gumastas to physically beat the farmers, destroy their food crops, or kidnap their cattle.
But by 1859, the peasants reached their absolute breaking point, marking the Blue Rebellion. And what stands out in the historical analysis here is the shifting alliances.
Yes, the Indigo system was so objectively brutal, so disruptive to the local order, that the local Zamindars actually threw their support behind the riots against the British planters.
The same landlords who regularly exploited the peasants? That is wild.
The Zamindars realized that the sheer violence and rampant land grabbing of the European planters was destroying their own local authority. So you see this rare unified front.
But the true heroism belonged to the riots. We see grassroots organizing at its most raw and effective. How did they actually break the system?
Through absolute, unyielding solidarity, they flat out refused to accept the advances or sow the indigo seeds. When the planters sent their heavily armed Lefeules, the riots fought back in pitched battles.
And crucially, it was a community-wide effort. Women defended their villages using household utensils, pots, and pans.
But the most devastating weapon they deployed was the social boycott. The entire village would collectively agree to cut off the planters and anyone who worked for them.
The ultimate tool of nonviolent resistance.
Exactly. Local barbers refused to shave the planters' agents. Water carriers refused to supply them. The riots essentially isolated the colonial factories from the surrounding society.
Supported by urban intellectuals in Calcutta who wrote devastating plays and news articles exposing the horrors of the indigo camps, the pressure just became unbearable.
The resistance was so absolute that the British government was forced to intervene and establish the Indigo Commission.
The findings were so damning that it fundamentally broke the indigo system in Bengal, forcing the planters to pack up their operations and shift entirely to Bihar.
A move that famously would set the stage for Mahatma Gandhi's intervention in Champaran decades later.
So we have covered a massive amount of historical ground today. From the intricate legal shell games of the Bengal Zamindars to the catastrophic cotton crash in the Deccan to the heroic uprisings of the Santhals and the indigo farmers.
It is a lot to take in.
It really is. How do we synthesize all of this? What is the overarching architecture we are looking at?
If we pull all these threads together, the Sunset Law, the Real Wari reassessments, the drawing of borders for Dominico, and the forced cultivation of indigo, we see one undeniable systemic pattern.
Which is?
Every single British policy served one overarching purpose. The colonial state engineered a system where the primary producers of wealth, the farmers, the indigenous tribes, the artisans, were forced to bear 100% of the risk of global market fluctuations, weather disasters, and policy changes.
Meanwhile, the colonial state and its intermediaries extracted all of the profit, funneling an entire rural society into an inescapable debt trap.
Exactly. The debt was not a glitch in the system. The debt was the operating system. It was the loosh used to control, extract from, and subjugate an entire subcontinent.
It is a profoundly sobering realization. We started by comparing this to a corporate takeover, and it really highlights the brutal, calculating efficiency of colonial economics.
It does. It shows how policies written in distant boardrooms physically reshape human lives on the ground.
For you listening, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We unpacked some incredibly heavy history today, but understanding the precise mechanisms of that oppression is so vital.
Absolutely. The historical patterns are undeniable once you know what to look for.
And I want to leave you with a lingering thought, something to explore long after this audio stops. Consider the anatomy of this 19th century debt trap.
Local farmers forced to bear the entire risk of distant global market crashes.
Predatory lending practices that manipulate confusing legal contracts. The stripping away of customary local protections in favor of ruthless efficiency.
It is a pattern that doesn't just stay in the 19th century.
Exactly. Look around the world today at the realities of modern agribusiness and the financial pressures on small farmers. How loudly do the echoes of that exact same system still ring in the vulnerabilities of rural agricultural communities right now? Until next time, keep diving deep.
You know, when we think about earthquakes, we almost exclusively focus on the moment the ground actually shakes.
Right, the visible destruction.
Exactly. We see the sudden, terrifying rumble, the collapsed buildings, and we just think, wow, that happened fast.
Yeah.
But, I mean, any geologist will tell you that the ground shaking is just the final, visible release of pressure. The real story is the decades of tectonic plates grinding together, silently building up this unbearable, invisible tension miles beneath the surface.
That is a perfect analogy for what we're looking at today.
Right, because today, for you listening, we are unpacking a massive historical earthquake, the Indian Revolt of 1857. We've got a comprehensive NCERT modern history text on the table for this deep dive, and our mission is to look way past the standard narrative of a simple, sepoy mutiny.
Because it was so much more than that.
Exactly. We are going to examine those tectonic shifts, the economic exploitation, the social upheaval, and just the immense pressure cooker that the British East India Company created over an entire century.
Yeah, focusing on the immediate spark is honestly one of the most common traps in history. I mean, if we only look at the famous Mutiny of the Soldiers, we completely missed the century of simmering tensions leading up to it.
Right.
By 1857, the British East India Company, they weren't just a trading entity anymore. They were this vast territorial power. And their main goal was extracting maximum revenue from the Indian subcontinent.
And they were pretty ruthless about it, right?
Oh, absolutely. British manufactured goods were just flooding the market, which essentially dismantled the traditional artisan economy. It left thousands of people completely jobless.
Wow.
And simultaneously, the agricultural sector had been hit by a really severe economic slump back in the 1790s. Agricultural commodity prices just tanked.
So the farmers were making less money.
Way less. It made it incredibly difficult for the peasants, who were known as ryots, to pay their exorbitant tax dues to the company.
Wait, I'm a bit confused here. If the East India Company was purely a profit-driven enterprise, wouldn't bankrupting the peasantry eventually destroy their own revenue stream?
You would think so.
I mean, it just seems like terrible business logic to squeeze the producers until they literally break.
It was incredibly short-sighted. But the
Yeah.
thing is, it was driven by the immediate demand for dividends in London.
Ah, right. Keep the shareholders happy.
Exactly. The company administrators on the ground, they were incentivized by short-term extraction, not long-term sustainability. And the primary mechanism for this was something called the Sunset Law.
Yeah, the sources outline this law, and the brutality of it is just striking. Like, imagine you owe taxes on your land.
Right.
The rule is literally that if the sun sets on a specific date and your payment hasn't been made in full, your entire estate is just immediately put up for auction.
And the mechanism of those auctions completely rewired Indian society. I mean, the Sunset Law ignored all the realities of agrarian life.
Like bad weather and stuff.
Yeah, droughts, fluctuating harvest yields, or, collapsing market rate. The British didn't care. And when an estate went to auction, it wasn't being bought by neighboring farmers.
Who was buying it?
It was often bought by urban traders and moneylenders, people who had capital but zero connection to the rural communities.
So they were essentially absentee landlords.
Actually, it was worse than that. Under the traditional system, local aristocrats, known as zamindars, collected taxes. And zamindars were not just landlords. They were an institution.
Right, they had a social role.
Exactly. They managed local justice, they maintained armies, sponsored festivals, and, crucially, they offered a safety net during famines.
Oh, wow. So when the companies stripped the zamindars of their power to consolidate British control, the peasants lost everything.
Yeah, they lost their entire social support system because those urban moneylenders who bought up the auction land, they just demanded maximum rent and offered zero protection.
It's like running an engine without oil just to save money.
That's a good way to put it.
You get this short-term boost in profit by not paying for maintenance, but eventually the friction causes the entire machine to violently seize up.
And it did seize up.
Right. And the ultimate friction point, according to the deep dive sources, was the annexation of Awadh in 1856. Governor General Dalhousie takes it over, and his official justification is, quote, misgovernance.
Yeah, the annexation of Awadh was the critical turning point. Awadh was the cultural and political heartland for so many in North India.
So Dalhousie's claim of misgovernance was just an excuse.
A very thinly veiled excuse for a massive land grab. And by annexing Awadh, the British didn't just change the flag on the palace, they completely upended the society.
How so?
Well, they disbanded the Nawab's army, which left tens of thousands of armed men suddenly unemployed and deeply resentful.
That seems like a terrible idea.
It really was. They stripped the local Nawabs, the regional rulers, and the Rajas of their authority, their respect, and their wealth. They even went as far as to stop stamping the Mughal king's name on local coins.
Wait, really? Just erased him from the currency?
Completely erased him.
That sends a really chilling message. I mean, for you listening, think about it. If the British can unilaterally dismantle Awadh, which was a historically loyal ally, then literally no one's culture, status, or livelihood in the entire subcontinent is safe.
Exactly. The psychological impact just cannot be overstated here. It breached a fundamental social contract. And the fallout, it didn't stay contained in the rural villages or the royal courts.
It bled into the military.
Yes, directly into the ranks of the British East India Company's own military force. Which brings us to the sepoys, the Indian soldiers employed by the British.
Right, and we often hear the story of the greased cartridges as the start of the whole rebellion. But based on what we're discussing, that was really just the match.
Oh, absolutely. The powder keg was already built. To understand the sepoys, we have to look at their sociology. Historians actually often describe them as peasants in uniform.
Peasants in uniform.
Yeah, because they were not these isolated mercenaries living in a military bubble. They shared living conditions, a common lifestyle, and caste backgrounds with the villagers.
And a lot of them were from Awad, right?
A massive percentage of the company's army was recruited directly from Awad.
So when a sepoy is, sitting there polishing his boots in the barracks, he's likely dealing with the emotional and economic fallout of his homeland being annexed.
Exactly.
His local ruler being deposed, and maybe his own family farm being auctioned off under that brutal sunset law.
It was incredibly personal for them. And furthermore, within the military structure itself, they faced severe discrimination. They had stagnant pay and almost a total lack of promotion opportunities compared to their European counterparts.
So the tension was just palpable.
It was. And the introduction of the new Enfield rifle cartridges was simply the breaking point. The cartridges had to be bitten open before loading, and rumors spread rapidly, and with good reason, honestly, that they were greased with cow and pig fat.
Which is deeply offensive to the religious sentiments of both Hindu and Muslim sepoys. But I want to dig into the mechanics of this offense because it wasn't just a matter of feeling disrespected, was it?
No, not at all. Consuming those animal fats meant a loss of caste and religious purity, which in 19th century India basically equated to social death.
Social death.
Yeah. A sepoy who used that cartridge could be completely ostracized by his own family. He'd be unable to marry off his children and just exiled from his community.
Wow. So the British were essentially forcing them to choose between their employment and their very existence within their society.
Exactly. They backed them into an impossible corner.
So the fuse is finally lit. Let's trace the timeline of this explosion. In April 1857, a sepoy named Mangal Pandey is executed in Barrackpore for rebelling against his officers.
Right.
And then the unrest spreads to the Meerut cantonment. On May 9th, 85 sepoys are court-martialed and jailed for refusing to touch the cartridges. And then the very next day, May 10th, the tectonic plates snap.
The May 10th mutiny in Meerut is just explosive. The sepoys violently liberate their imprisoned colleagues, attack the British officers, set fire to the cantonment, and declare war on the company.
It's a full-on uprising.
It is. But the most crucial strategic decision they make happens immediately afterward. They don't just scatter into the countryside or simply loot the local treasury.
What do?
They march overnight, straight to Delhi.
See, I find that so interesting. Why Delhi? I mean, the East India Company had the real power. The Mughal emperor in Delhi, Bahadur Shah Zafar, he was elderly, practically powerless, and essentially living on a British pension.
Sure.
So why march toward this fated empire?
Because the sepoys recognize a fundamental rule of warfare. A mutiny is just a riot without a sovereign.
Oh, they needed legitimacy.
Exactly. They need political legitimacy. The East India Company was this massive bureaucratic machine. To fight it, the sepoys needed a symbol of authority that predated British rule and held major cultural weight across the subcontinent.
Right.
By arriving in Delhi, joining forces with the local garrisons, and essentially coercing Bahadur Shah Zafar to endorse the rebellion, they instantly transformed a military mutiny into a legitimate war of independence.
I just find that visual incredibly striking. You have these desperate, furious soldiers surrounding a hesitant, aging emperor, demanding that he lead them.
And it worked.
It really did. Once Zafar's name was on the proclamations, the dynamics shifted entirely. It gave local chiefs, displaced zamindars, and ordinary people the legal and moral cover they needed to rise up.
Yeah, the texts note that by May and June, British authority in North India had basically collapsed like a house of cards.
Which is insane to think about. But that sudden collapse creates a massive power vacuum, right?
Huge.
And while the emperor in Delhi provided the symbolic umbrella, a rebellion covering hundreds of thousands of square miles requires actual local logistical organization.
Exactly. And since the official aristocracy had largely been dismantled or pacified by the British, unlikely grassroots heroes had to step up to manage the rebellion, collect taxes, and direct troop movements.
Let's focus on these grassroots figures because this is where the sheer scale of the organization really becomes clear to me. We have to talk about Malevi Ahmadullah Shah.
Ah, yes. Famously known as Danka Shah.
Right, so tell us about him.
Well, Ahmadullah Shah is this fascinating study in ideological leadership. He was an influential Maulvi, a Muslim cleric, but he didn't just preach quietly in a mosque. He mobilized the masses through sheer spectacle and this incredible prophetic fervor.
The sources say he traveled in palanquins with grand processions, right?
Yeah, led by men beating drums, which is actually how he earned the name Danka Shah, meaning the Shah with the drum. He publicly prophesied the imminent end of British rule and advocated for jihad against the colonizers.
But how does a preacher transition into a military commander, though? I mean, it's one thing to give a fiery speaks in the bazaar, but it's another to fight the British Army.
He understood that religious zeal could be directly channeled into military discipline. When the rebellion broke out, he didn't just offer spiritual guidance. He rallied a massive force of followers, took up arms, and fought fiercely.
He actually won battles, didn't he?
He did. At the Battle of Chinhat, his forces actually defeated the British forces led by Sir Henry Lawrence. He effectively kept the British out of Lucknow for months.
That's incredible. And then on the other end of the social spectrum, representing a completely different demographic, we have Shamal.
Right. Shamal is such an important figure.
He was a Jat from the Pargana of Bharut in Uttar Pradesh, a region comprising 84 villages known as the Sharasaid Days, and his community was being systematically destroyed by those brutal sunset law taxes we talked about.
Yeah, they were losing their ancestral lands to outsiders left and right. Shamal really illustrates the civilian parallel to the Sepoy Rebellion. He mobilized the headmen and peasants of those 84 villages to actively dismantle the colonial infrastructure.
So they were sabotaging the British.
Oh, entirely. And, this wasn't just an angry mob. It was highly targeted. They destroyed bridges, they dug up roads, and cut telegraph wires to completely paralyze British troop movements.
The sources mention he even set up a makeshift justice system and an intelligence network. I mean, I want to understand how a peasant leader practically organizes an intelligence network against a global empire.
Well, he utilized the natural geography and the deep local ties of his community. Shamal's people knew the Doab region intimately. They used local couriers to monitor British movements.
Like a grassroots spy ring.
Exactly. They intercepted official colonial mail to gather strategic information, and they even established parallel courts in a large house in Bharut to settle local disputes.
Which effectively proves that the region no longer needed British magistrates at all.
Right. He was referred to locally as Raja before he died fighting in July 1857.
And it's crucial to mention for you listening, he wasn't an isolated case. You had Nana Sahib in Kanpur taking leadership, the iconic Rani of Shansi, Begum Hazrat Mahal in Lucknow, who took charge when her husband was exiled.
Yeah.
And in Bihar, Kunwar Singh, this elderly zemindar, well into his 80s, who allied with rebel sepoys and engaged in brilliant guerrilla warfare against the British for months.
These individuals are so vital to our understanding because they provided the organizational skeleton of the revolt. The sepoys supplied the initial military force, but leaders like Shamal and Kunwar Singh created the administrative structures.
Even if they were temporary.
Even temporary, they demonstrated that the Indian populace was entirely capable of self-governance and coordinated resistance.
Which brings us to a really compelling question about how we remember history, because this was the largest armed resistance to colonialism in the 19th century globally.
Without a doubt.
But the records of the event are heavily skewed. I mean, the British won the military conflict and they wrote the official administrative reports.
Yeah, the colonial archive is literally a battlefield of representation. The British dominated the physical records, the memos, the parliamentary reports, the official histories.
So they got to write the story.
They did. And through these documents, they actively painted the rebels in a deeply negative light, framing the event merely as a mutiny of ungrateful soldiers and a few disgruntled royals. They focused overwhelmingly on British victimhood to justify their subsequent retaliation.
And this war of representation wasn't just in text, right? It was heavily visual. The deep dive sources specifically highlight British paintings from the era, like Joseph Noel Paton's In Memoriam.
Oh. In Memoriam is a masterclass in visual propaganda. The painting depicts British women and children huddled together in absolute terror, anticipating violence from the rebels.
Which, I mean, completely removes the context of British economic exploitation or the aggressive land grab.
Completely removes it. And more importantly, it omits the horrific, indiscriminate violence that British troops were actively inflicting on Indian civilians during their suppression campaigns.
Right.
Paintings like this were circulated widely in Britain to stir up public outrage and basically manufacture consent for brutal martial law tactics in India.
Here's where it gets really interesting for you, though, listener. We have to read between the lines. If the official archives and the contemporary paintings are essentially colonial propaganda, how do historians actually uncover what the Indian rebels were thinking and feeling?
To understand the rebel mindset, historians have to look past the official archive and examine alternative sources. Things like oral traditions, folk tales, and critically, the Ishtihars.
What exactly were the Ishtihars?
They were proclamations and posters printed in Hindi, Urdu, and Persian, and they were often pasted up in bazaars and military camps.
So they were meant for the public.
Yeah, because they were written by the rebels for the local populace, they offer a direct, unfiltered window into the ideology of the resistance.
And what is the core message in these proclamations? Is it just, a call to violence, or is there a specific political vision there?
There's absolutely a political vision. The most striking element of the Ishtihars is their powerful unifying message. They consistently emphasize Hindu-Muslim unity against the Faranges, the foreigners.
Which is fascinating because the British constantly tried to stir up religious discord to divide the rebellion.
Exactly. They tried everything to split them. But the proclamations show this desperate, united desire to protect their shared culture, their respective religions, and their economic livelihoods.
So they were appealing to everyone.
Every strata of society, merchants, artisans, peasants, and religious leaders. They framed the British as a common existential threat to the entire traditional order.
It's just a profound contrast. The British official records describe chaotic, savage anarchy, but the Ishtihars reveal a highly conscious, organized effort to restore a pre-British social equilibrium.
Yeah, a world where communities coexisted, zamindars protected their tenants, and artisans weren't driven to starvation by imported goods.
This contrast really reveals why looking at diverse sources is so critical. The official archives show us the mechanics of colonial suppression, but the folk tales and proclamations show us the emotional and ideological heart of the Indian resistance.
Beautifully said.
Let's look at the mechanics of that suppression, though. Because while the rebels had incredible organization and zeal, the British ultimately had the industrial and military might to crush the physical uprising.
They did. But the sheer scale of the 1857 revolt forced London to realize that treating a subcontinent of millions purely as a corporate extraction zone was completely unsustainable.
The immediate British retaliation was exceptionally intense and punitive, right?
Oh, it was brutal. In May and June of 1857, they imposed martial law across North India. British officers were given the power to try and execute Indians without any standard legal processes.
Summary executions.
Yeah. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were burned to the ground, and thousands of sepoys and civilians were killed. But once the physical territory was reclaimed, the British government realized their entire framework of governance had to be dismantled.
This leads to the Government of India Act 1858. Explain what this actually meant on the ground, because it wasn't just a paperwork change, was it? Not at all. The 1858 Act was a massive structural overhaul. It permanently stripped the East India Company of its ruling powers and transferred control of India directly to the British Crown.
So no more corporate rule.
Exactly. Imagine a ruthless, profit-driven corporation that manages a country being completely bought out and replaced by a sovereign nation's bureaucracy overnight. A new cabinet post, the Secretary of State for India, was created in London.
Wow.
The era of aggressive, unchecked expansionism by a rogue trading company was over. It was replaced by a centralized, highly cautious, and honestly, deeply paranoid colonial administration.
Well, I mean, the paranoia makes sense. They had just faced a near collapse because the very army they built turned its weapons on them.
Right.
How do you go about rebuilding a military apparatus after that? You can't just hire the same people.
You completely restructure the demographics. The British drastically reduced the overall number of Indian soldiers and significantly increased the European presence to maintain a strategic balance.
Okay, that makes logistical sense for them. But more importantly, they shifted their recruitment focus. The heart of the rebellion was in Awadh and Bengal. So the British stopped recruiting from those regions almost entirely.
Where did they look instead?
They turned to groups they categorized under their new martial race theory, specifically Gurkhas, Sikhs, and Pathans.
And what was the logic behind that?
The logic was deeply cynical. These groups were culturally and geographically distinct from the Awadh sepoys, and in some cases, they had historical animosities toward the former Mughal Empire.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, the British purposefully engineered an army composed of disparate groups to ensure they could never unite under a single cultural or religious banner again.
That is the very definition of a divide and rule strategy. Did they apply this division tactic to the civilian society as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The British analyzed the rebellion and decided they needed a loyal buffer class to prevent future uprisings. So they completely reversed their stance on the local aristocracy.
Wait, so they went back to supporting the zamindars?
Yes. Instead of stripping zamindars of their land, the British began actively protecting landlord rights, rewarding those who stayed loyal with massive estates.
Interesting.
Simultaneously, they viewed the Muslim population with deep, lingering suspicion, largely blaming them for the rebellion's attempt to restore the Mughal emperor.
Right.
This led to widespread discrimination and confiscation of property, deliberately fracturing the Hindu-Muslim unity that the Ishtihars had worked so hard to build.
Let's synthesize everything we've unpacked today. We started with the invisible tension, the devastating economic policies, the sunset law, the dismantling of traditional leaders in Awadh.
Right, the root causes.
And we saw how the anger of the bankrupt peasant flowed directly into the barracks, turning the sepoy into the tip of the spear for a much larger societal fury.
And then we examined the sheer organizational capacity of local heroes like Shah Mal and Maulvi Amdul Shah, who just stepped into the void to challenge a global empire.
Yeah.
We also saw how the British utilized art and archives to paint themselves as victims, while ruthlessly reorganizing their empire under the crown, embedding deep societal divisions to maintain control.
So the British win the military conflict. They crush the uprising, they replace the East India Company with the direct rule of the crown, and they redesign the army to prevent another mutiny. If they solidified their grip that much, what is the actual legacy of 1857?
The legacy is foundational. While the physical uprising was suppressed, the British inadvertently created exactly what they feared most, a shared history of resistance.
A shared history.
Yes, 1857 was the first time that people from various regions, religions, and economic classes united against a common colonial enemy on such a massive scale. It shattered the myth of British invincibility.
Right.
Over the next several decades, the memory of 1857 wasn't lost. It was preserved in the very folktales, songs, and memories of local heroes we discussed. It provided the emotional, psychological, and historical scaffolding for the organized Indian freedom struggle that would follow in the 20th century.
The earthquake of 1857 released the pressure of a century of exploitation, and even though the British rebuilt their structures on top of the rubble, the ground was never truly stable again.
Never again.
Imagine you are living in the aftermath. Think about what happens to the psyche of a nation when the generation that witnessed the fierce, united resistance of 1857, the generation that saw Shah Mal mobilize villages and Dunka Shah rally armies, passes those whispered stories and memories down to the very children who would eventually bring the British Empire to its knees. That's where we'll leave it for today.
So, imagine trying to dismantle a 2,000-year-old system of just absolute social control. And your primary weapon isn't a gun or like a riot, it's a dictionary.
Right, it really is.
Today, we are looking at how a group of 19th century reformers hacked the most rigid social hierarchies on Earth, using the establishment's own ancient texts against it.
It is one of the most fascinating intellectual rebellions in history, because these reformers realized early on that to change a deeply traditional society, attacking tradition from the outside usually just creates this massive brick wall of defense.
Yeah, they just shut down.
Exactly. So you have to get inside the architecture of their beliefs. You have to use their own language.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are thrilled you're joining us. Today, we have a dense, but honestly incredibly revealing stack of notes from an NCERT history text. Specifically, we're focusing on Chapter 5, which is Women, Caste, and Reforms.
It's a heavy one, but so important.
It really is.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to understand how a deeply stratified 19th century India actually began to, pull apart its most entrenched inequalities. And we're going to trace the exact mechanisms these reformers used to do it.
And we really are tracing a massive shift here for you today. We're talking about the immense gravity of human struggles that, laid the foundational blueprint for a modern egalitarian nation.
It wasn't overnight.
Oh, not at all. This wasn't just a sudden political revolution. It was a grueling, decades-long social reckoning.
So let's start with those first ripples of change. You mentioned they went inside the architecture of belief, which is a great phrase. I want to look at Raja Rammohan Roy, because he sort of seems to be the pioneer of this tactic, right?
He absolutely was. So Roy, who founded the Brahma Sabha back in 1828, was a polyglot. He was deeply well-versed in Sanskrit, Persian, and several other languages.
Right.
And his immediate focus was the horrific reality faced by widows. He was specifically fighting against the practice of sati.
Let's pause there for a second, because the reality of sati is just staggering if you haven't studied it. We're talking about the historical practice where a widow was expected, or in many cases, outright forced to sit on her deceased husband's funeral pyre and burn to death, correct?
That is correct. It was a brutal reality, but crucially, it was framed by the orthodoxy as this supreme act of religious devotion.
Right, they justified it.
Exactly. And the brilliance of Rammohan Roy was that he realized simply shouting, "This is a human rights violation," wouldn't work at all. The conservative establishment would just dismiss him as being, corrupted by Western British ideas.
So he beats them at their own game.
Yeah.
If they claim it's a religious mandate, he actually goes and reads the original ancient Sanskrit text to see if the mandate even exists.
He did the deep textual research, and he proved the mandate wasn't there.
Wow.
Yeah. He published tracts demonstrating that the oldest, most foundational ancient scriptures offered zero sanction for burning widows.
That is fascinating. It's almost like he was an early legal hacker. Like, he didn't try to burn down the mainframe. He went into their legacy code, found a bug in how they were interpreting their own rules, and used it to shut the whole practice down.
I love that analogy. He completely debugged the social system. And the British officials, who were already pretty critical of Indian traditions, they were more than willing to listen to an Indian scholar who is using native texts to argue for reform.
Makes sense.
So Roy's textual strategy directly led to the banning of sati in 1829.
And once that door is open, the legal hacking template is basically set.
Exactly. Take Ishwarchandra Vidyasagar a few decades later. He recognized that surviving as a widow was its own kind of social death. So he used the exact same textual strategy, mining those ancient sacred texts to argue that widow remarriage was actually permitted.
But I imagine the Orthodox establishment wasn't just going to sit back and let him rewrite the rules of social conduct like that.
Oh, the backlash was fierce. Vidyasagar faced severe social boycotts. People were furious because this threatened the absolute core of patriarchal control.
Right.
But his meticulous arguments paid off when a law permitting widow remarriage was finally passed in 1856. And this wasn't just an isolated Bengali phenomenon either. Down in the Madras presidency, Veerasalingam Pantulu formed an entire association dedicated to widow remarriage.
It's incredible how that initial spark just caught fire across the subcontinent. But here's where I think the narrative really needs to shift.
Right.
Because while men like Roy and Vidyasagar started the public debate, men speaking on behalf of women only gets you so far.
Very true.
Eventually, women take the microphone. They demand their own agency.
And the mechanism to secure that agency was always education. Reformers knew that an uneducated population is an easily controlled population. So the mid-19th century sees this massive, organized push for girls' schools.
Who was leading that charge?
Well, Jyotirao Phule in Maharashtra and the Arya Samaj in Punjab, they began establishing educational institutions specifically for girls.
And we see this cutting across religious lines as well, don't we?
We do, yeah. Powerful Muslim reformists stepped into the arena, too. You have Mumtaz Ali, who basically mirrored Rammohan Roy's tactic. She reinterpreted verses from the Quran to argue passionately for women's education.
Oh, wow. Using the exact same playbook.
Exactly. And by the early 20th century, the Begums of Bhopal played a crucial role by founding a primary school for girls at Aligarh.
And then there's Begum Rokeya Sakawat Hossain. She feels like a completely different kind of energy in this whole timeline.
She was fiercely uncompromising. I mean, she started schools for Muslim girls in Patna and Calcutta, but beyond that, she was a relentless critic of conservative ideas across the board.
What was her main critique?
She openly argued that religious leaders of every single faith had engineered their interpretations specifically to assign an inferior status to women.
So when women finally get access to this education and they begin to write and publish, what does that actually look like? What are the specific arguments they are making about their own lives?
They were writing with a blistering, just unapologetic clarity. A perfect example is Tardabai Shinde. She was educated at home in Pune, and she published a book called Struparushtulna, which translates to a comparison between women and men.
What was the core of her argument in that text?
It was a surgical dissection of social hypocrisy. She pointed out the brutal double standards in how value was assigned to human life. She wrote about how a woman's life is treated as if it's made of dust or rusted iron, while a man's life is treated like the purest gold.
Wow, just the imagery there. Rusted iron versus pure as gold.
It's powerful.
It strips away all that religious framing and exposes the raw economics and just the cruelty of it.
She detailed the visceral reality of widowhood, too, how the moment a woman's husband died, the barber would come to shave her head. She would be shut out from weddings and auspicious occasions, and her very face was suddenly considered a bad omen.
That is heartbreaking.
And from that devastating critique came the realization that words weren't enough. There had to be institutional safety nets. Pandita Ramabai, who was a formidable Sanskrit scholar herself, recognized the miserable lives of upper caste Hindu widows.
So she took action.
She didn't just write about it, no. She founded a widow's home in Pune.
And the key here is that it wasn't just an asylum or, like, a shelter.
Right. It was a place where women were explicitly trained so they could support themselves economically.
Because economic independence is the ultimate threat to a rigid hierarchy. If you can feed yourself, you don't have to submit to the system.
Precisely.
And all of this groundwork eventually forces the hand of the law, right? We see victories like the Child Marriage Restraint Act of 1929.
Yes, though it's important to note the Orthodox backlash never really went away. Conservative factions constantly framed these reforms as Western corruption that was eroding traditional family values. But the momentum of women claiming their own space had become pretty much unstoppable at that point.
Which brings us to a crucial pivot in our deep dive today. Because here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. Once you teach people to use a critical lens to expose the hypocrisy of gender roles, it is basically inevitable that the exact same lens will be turned toward the caste system.
The muscle of critical questioning was being flexed, and it naturally targeted the fight for spiritual and social equality next. We see early traces of this with Ram Mohan Roy. Again, he actually translated an old Buddhist text that was highly critical of caste.
It was everywhere.
He was. And later, in 1867, the Pradhana Samaj in Bombay began invoking bhakti traditions to argue against caste hierarchy.
For our listeners who might not be familiar, can you give a quick primer on what the bhakti traditions were and, why they were dangerous to the caste system?
Broadly speaking, the Bhakti movement was a centuries-old tradition that emphasized deep personal devotion to the divine. The radical part is that it believed in the spiritual equality of all people, completely regardless of birth.
So it bypasses the hierarchy.
It bypasses the need for high caste priests to act as intermediaries altogether. By reviving this, groups like the Pradhana Samaj and earlier the Paramhans Mandali in Bombay in 1840, they were actively working to delegitimize the religious justification for caste.
But again, if we're just talking about translating Buddhist texts or debating bhakti philosophy, those sound like very high-level conversations among the educated elite. How did the push against caste actually reach the grassroots? Like, how did it change the daily reality of someone at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy?
The shift from philosophy to practical reality happened through new institutions and new economic tools. Christian missionaries, for example, began setting up schools specifically for tribal groups and lower caste children.
And I imagine literacy in that context isn't just about reading books, it's an economic exit strategy.
Exactly. It equipped these children with the resources to navigate a rapidly changing world. With education, they could find jobs in new factories or expanding municipalities, rather than being permanently bound to their inherited role in the village hierarchy.
So we have economic mobility happening. But what about spiritual leadership from within those communities themselves?
That was equally vital. We see powerful grassroots leaders emerging from the very communities being marginalized. In eastern Bengal, Haridas Thakur's Matua sect worked directly among the Chandala cultivators, a group pushed to the absolute margins of society.
What did he do?
Thakur openly questioned the caste system found in Brahmanical texts. He empowered his followers to reject it.
And down in the south, in present-day Kerala, there's Sri Narayana Guru.
Yes, he was a massive figure. He came from the Azava caste, which is a community historically forced into rigid lower caste boundaries. He didn't bother arguing with the ancient texts, though. He proclaimed a new, unifying mantra that just shook the foundations of social division.
What was the mantra?
He stated one caste, one religion, one God for humankind.
I love that, because it's so simple. But in a society obsessed with categorizing every single human interaction, It is an incredibly radical statement of a universal human dignity.
It rendered the entire complex hierarchy irrelevant in one sentence.
But then, someone comes along who doesn't just bypass the historical texts, he aggressively deconstructs the entire historical narrative of how the caste system was built in the first place. I'm talking about Jyotirao Phule.
Yes. If we move from spiritual equality to historical deconstruction, Phule is the master architect. Born in 1827 and educated in missionary schools, he launched a massive, systemic attack on what was known as the Aryan theory.
Okay, let's break down this Aryan theory and explain how Phule turned it completely upside down.
The traditional Orthodox narrative claimed that Brahmins, the upper castes, were superior because they were descended from Aryans. Phule argued the exact opposite.
Boy, really?
Yes, he asserted that the Aryans were actually foreign invaders. According to his reading of history, they came in, defeated, and violently subjugated the true indigenous children of the country.
Oh, wow. He totally flipped the script. He took their primary point of pride and turned it into an accusation of historical theft.
He essentially said to the upper castes, "You have absolutely no rightful claim to this land or this power. The land belongs to the indigenous people, the so-called lower castes."
That is a massive paradigm shift.
It was. And to organize this radical thought into action, he founded the Satyashodhak Samaj, the Truth Seekers Society. Its goal was to unite the Shudras, which were the laboring castes, and the Atishudras, those deemed untouchables by the Orthodox system, to propagate absolute caste equality.
What I find most fascinating about Phule is his global perspective. We tend to think of history in these isolated geographical bubbles. But in 1873, Phule writes a book called Gulamgiri, which translates to slavery. And he dedicates it to a very specific group of people halfway across the world.
This is one of the most profound comparative leaps in modern history. He dedicated Gulamgiri to all the Americans who had fought to free slaves during the American Civil War.
He drew a direct conceptual line from the social hierarchy of India to the brutal reality of the American South.
He established a comparative link between the systemic, generations-deep oppression of lower castes in India and the reality of black slaves in America. By doing that, he was universalizing the struggle.
Making it a global human rights issue.
Right. He was telling his followers and the world, our struggle is not just a local religious dispute. This is a universal fight for fundamental human freedom.
That is just brilliant framing. So Phule provides this massive ideological framework, but as we move into the 20th century, we see this push for equality escalate. It moves out of the books and into direct, defiant physical action.
This brings us to two towering revolutionary figures, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in the West and E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar, better known as Periyar, in the South.
Let's start with Ambedkar, because unlike the early elite reformers we talked about, his fight wasn't theoretical. It was deeply, painfully personal.
His early life was defined by the visceral reality of untouchability. Ambedkar was born into a Mahar family. As a child, he wasn't allowed to sit inside the classroom with the other students. He had to sit on the ground outside.
Unbelievable.
He wasn't even allowed to drink from the same water taps that upper caste children used. But despite this systemic exclusion, he persevered, secured a fellowship, and actually went to the U.S. for higher studies. When he returned to India in 1919, he weaponized his world-class education against caste power.
And that leads us to 1927 and the famous temple entry movements, specifically the Mahad Satyagraha. Now, he leads his followers to drink water from a public tank connected to a temple. But why focus on a water tank? Like, if you're a brilliant U.S.-educated lawyer, why not focus purely on legislation?
Because legislation doesn't immediately change social psychology. Ambedkar understood the mechanics of symbolic power perfectly. In this society, who can touch what? Who can enter a temple? Who can share water? These are the invisible electric fences of the caste system.
They reinforce the hierarchy every single day.
Exactly.
So it's about forcing the invisible fences to become visible.
Ambedkar led 3 of these movements between 1927 and 1935. By drinking that water, he wasn't just hydrating, he was physically breaking the taboo. He was forcing Orthodox society to recognize Dalits as equal human beings who had a right to public spaces. He was tearing down the psychological barriers before attacking the legal ones.
It's irrefutable physical proof of the equality. Now, let's look down south to Periyar. His turning point also involved physical segregation, but in a very different context. He was actually inside the nationalist movement, wasn't he?
He was. Periyar was originally an ascetic who had deeply studied Sanskrit scriptures. He He became a member of the Congress Party, actively participating in the fight against British colonialism, but he left the party in absolute disgust.
Wait, if he was studying Sanskrit and was in the Nationalist Congress Party, that sounds like the exact profile of someone who would uphold the traditional system. What broke that alignment?
He attended a feast organized by the Nationalists, and at this feast, he saw that the seating was rigidly segregated by caste. The lower castes were made to sit at a distance from the upper caste.
At a nationalist event.
Yes. And in that moment, he realized a bitter truth. Even those fighting for political freedom from the British were still desperately clinging to their own social supremacy.
I mean, you can't claim to be a champion of freedom if you're actively segregating your own dinner table.
Precisely. He realized political freedom was meaningless without social dignity, so he founded the self-respect movement. His core argument was that the untouchables were actually the true upholders of an original Tamil and Dravidian culture, a culture that had been subjugated by incoming Brahmins.
And unlike Ramohan Roy, who tried to reinterpret the scriptures gently, Periyar didn't pull any punches with his critiques of the ancient texts, did he?
Not at all. Periyar fiercely and unapologetically attacked the most revered Hindu scriptures, the codes of Manu, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Ramayana.
Wow, going right for the foundational texts.
He argued that these texts were not divine revelations at all. They were engineered political tools created specifically to establish Brahmanical authority over lower castes and the domination of men over women.
Naturally, this level of direct action and fierce critique caused a massive reaction from the establishment, I assume.
It deeply unsettled Orthodox society. In response, we see the creation of associations specifically aimed at defending the old ways. In the north, you had the Sanatan Dhamma Sabhas and the Bharat Dharma Mahamandal. In Bengal, the Brahman Sabha,
They organized to push back.
their entire objective was to uphold caste as a cornerstone of Hinduism and argue that it was absolutely sanctified by scripture.
So the battle lines are clearly drawn. The push for equality met the wall of orthodoxy. But society doesn't transform just because of a few protests at water tanks or fiery speeches. To really change a subcontinent, there has to be an institutional engine driving this changing mindset across the country, right?
Yes, and that institutionalization was happening simultaneously across almost every major religious and cultural community. The tactics shifted from individual critique to building massive alternative institutions.
I'm assuming education was at the center of that. Because you can't deconstruct a history if people aren't taught how to think critically in the first place.
Education was the primary engine, but it was how they approached it that mattered. Take the Young Bengal movement in Calcutta in the 1820s. It was led by Henry Louis Vivian Garozio, a teacher at Hindu college. He didn't just teach standard curriculum, he actively trained his students to question all absolute authority.
A radical educator.
Very much so. He was cultivating a generation whose default setting was critical thinking rather than blind obedience.
And we see similar institutional networks spreading south, like the Veda Samaj in Madras in 1864, which was, inspired by the Brahmo Samaj to fight caste distinctions. But what about the intersection of religion and direct social service?
That brings us to Swami Vivekananda and the Ramakrishna mission. Vivekananda took the ancient Vedanta philosophy, which essentially sees the divine in all things, and gave it a radically practical application.
How so?
He argued that if the divine is in everyone, then serving the poor and marginalized isn't just charity. It is the highest form of religious worship. He elevated Indian philosophy on the global stage at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893, but his core focus remained on salvation through selfless social action.
And this institutional approach wasn't just limited to Hindu reformers. We see major shifts in the Muslim and Sikh communities as well, focusing on modernizing their populations.
Absolutely. Sayyid Ahmed Khan recognized the immediate need for modern scientific thought. In 1875, he founded the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College at Aligarh, which became the heart of the Aligarh movement.
And what was his main goal there?
His goal was to bridge Islamic theology with Western science and modern education. Similarly, among the Sikhs, the Singh Sabha movement emerged. Starting in Amritsar in 1873 and then Lahore, they built an institutional network to actively rid Sikhism of creeping caste distinctions and superstitions while heavily promoting education through the Khalsa College network.
Okay, so what does this all mean? When you step back and look at all these sources, from Ramahan Roy reading Sanskrit tracts to Ambedkar at the water tank to the schools in Aligarh.
Right.
Wait, no, let me rephrase. When you look at all these different approaches, what is the ultimate legacy we are looking at?
If we synthesize this entire era, the core truth is these were not just isolated arguments over old books or seating arrangements. The grueling social struggles of these men and women were the very foundation stones upon which a modern, egalitarian India was built.
They were doing the necessary demolition work.
Exactly. They did the heavy lifting of dismantling the old, rigid, unequal structures, the conceptual groundwork for the democracy, the equality, and the justice that would eventually be enshrined in the nation's constitution that was laid by these reformers.
Without them, things look very different.
Without their social reckoning, any political independence from the British would have simply handed power from foreign elites back to domestic elites.
The social revolution really had to precede the political one. Well, we've covered a massive amount of ground today, from the texts of antiquity to the American Civil War and back to the schools of Aligarh. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. But before we go, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We've seen how 19th century reformers used ancient texts, new schools, and even global events to reveal the massive blind spots of their own society. They looked at things everyone accepted as just the way things are and proved they were actually oppressive systems. So it makes you wonder, what are the systems, the cultural algorithms, or the unquestioned norms we should be scrutinizing today, right now, to recognize the invisible inequalities still hiding in plain sight in our modern world? Until next time, keep questioning the foundation.
Imagine for a second that you're tasked with uniting a continent-sized region.
Okay, that's quite a task.
Right. And not just a big piece of land, but a place with, hundreds of different languages.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Multiple competing religions, and a deeply entrenched, really rigid social hierarchy. And your ultimate goal is to unite all of these incredibly diverse people to overthrow the largest, most powerful empire in human history.
I mean, honestly, it sounds like a purely hypothetical scenario from like a political science class.
Exactly.
A thought experiment designed by a professor just to prove that total unity on that kind of massive, sprawling scale is, well, that it's simply impossible to achieve.
But the crazy thing is, it wasn't hypothetical. That is exactly the monumental task that was accomplished in India. So welcome to today's deep dive.
We're excited to get into this one.
For those of you listening, especially if you're prepping for exams or just love history, we know why you're here. You want to understand the actual mechanics of history. You want those aha moments, and you want to get to the core of the subject without drowning in a dry textbook.
Yeah, nobody wants that.
Right. So today we are acting as your ultimate guide to the Indian national movement. We're looking at a curated stack of historical texts spanning from the late 19th century right up to 1948, basically mapping out how the Indian subcontinent broke the colonial grip of the British Empire.
And our mission today is to move far past just memorizing a zero-skip timeline of dates.
Please, no rote memorization.
Exactly. We're going to unpack the underlying mechanisms, right? The brilliant political strategies, the deeply emotional, visceral tragedies, and the sharply contrasting ideologies that define this era.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
It is. We're looking at everything from the quiet, subversive power of a spinning wheel to the explosive force of armed uprisings.
So we're covering the entire timeline from the foundation of the Congress to independence. Let's set the stage in 1885.
Okay, 1885.
This is when organized political resistance really begins to take a formal shape. But what strikes me about the start of this movement is the profound irony of it. The resistance doesn't start with pitchforks and torches, right?
No, not at all.
It starts with British-educated elites using British legal frameworks to challenge the empire itself.
That is the perfect way to frame it. So in December 1885, you have the formation of the Indian National Congress, or the INC, in Bombay. But if you were there, it wouldn't look like a revolution.
Just a bunch of guys in a room.
Basically. It was just 72 delegates from across the country. And these were largely lawyers, journalists, and professionals who spoke perfect English.
Right.
They were actually guided by figures like A.O. Hume, a retired British civil servant, alongside Indian visionaries like Dadabhai Naoroji.
Naoroji is a figure we absolutely have to pause on. Here you have this highly successful businessman who was largely settled in London.
Yeah, he was well established there.
For a time, he even managed to get elected as a member of the British Parliament. And he wrote a book that our sources highlight as an absolute cornerstone of this movement. It's a real UPSC keyword for anyone studying this era, called Poverty and Un-British Rule in India.
The brilliance of Naoroji's book wasn't just that it, complained about the British.
Right, it wasn't just whining.
No, it was a devastating mathematical indictment of how the British economy functioned in India. He introduced the drain of wealth theory. He didn't just say India was poor, he proved the exact mechanics of why it was poor.
Let's actually break down that mechanism for the listener because it is an absolute masterclass in colonial exploitation.
Oh, definitely.
The British were essentially using Indian tax revenue to buy Indian goods and then exporting those goods back to Britain. So the British weren't trading with India. They were essentially getting Indian exports for free, funded by the taxes of the very people making the goods.
It's just wild when you think about it.
Yeah.
And that system had a brutal ripple effect on the ground.
How so?
Well, to extract those taxes, the British completely re-engineered the rural economy. They empowered local landlords, known as zamindars, giving them absolute ownership of the land as long as they delivered massive, fixed revenue quotas to the British.
Basically turning them into debt collectors?
Exactly. Ruthless debt collectors. If a peasant couldn't pay due to, say, a drought, their land was seized. So Nehru was exposing this systemic siphoning of wealth that was funding Britain's Industrial Revolution while literally leaving Indian peasants to starve.
And while Nairoji's is exposing this in London and India, we see the sparks of resistance interlocking globally, right?
Yes, the diaspora was getting involved.
The sources mention the Natal Congress being formed in 1895 over in South Africa. It highlights how the Indian diaspora was simultaneously organizing against colonial policies across the world. But back in India, the early INC's approach to Nehruji's revelations was surprisingly polite.
Yeah, this was the era of the moderates. Their foundational belief was a bit naive in hindsight. They believed that the British Parliament fundamentally respected the ideals of freedom and justice. Their logic was that the British public simply didn't know how bad things were in India.
Oh, like if they only knew, they'd stop.
Exactly. So their strategy was to write well-argued petitions, pass resolutions, and ask for logical reforms. Things like separating the judiciary from the executive branch or repealing the Arms Act.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. The moderate strategy is it's like trying to negotiate with a landlord who is actively robbing your apartment.
That's a great analogy.
You're writing them polite letters saying, "Dear sir, please leave my television alone," while they are actively carrying it out the front door.
Pretty much.
At some point, polite letters stop making sense, and a new group steps in saying it's time to just stop paying rent entirely.
Which is the exact shift we see by the 1890s with the rise of the radicals. You have the famous trio known as Lal Bal Pal.
Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and Bipin Chandra Pal.
Right. They looked at the moderates' petition strategy and dismissed it entirely as the politics of prayers. Tilak, using his Marathi newspaper Kasari, told the public that freedom wasn't something you begged for, it was your birthright.
They realized you cannot petition your way out of subjugation. You have to hurt the colonizer's bottom line.
And that introduces the mechanism of Swadeshi.
Another massive keyword.
Yes. Swadeshi literally means of one's own country. The radicals championed self-reliance and an aggressive, active boycott of British goods. This wasn't just a political philosophy, it was a daily reality.
Like, what did that look like on the ground?
People were organizing massive bonfires of imported Manchester cloth in the streets of Bengal. Priests were actually refusing to officiate weddings if the bride or groom wore imported silk.
Wow, so it penetrated every level of society.
Totally. They were setting up indigenous schools and factories. They wanted Swaraj, or self-rule, through mass economic mobilization.
So you have this intense ideological clash building inside the Indian National Congress. On one hand, the moderates want to negotiate a better deal within the empire. On the other hand, the radicals want to economically paralyze the empire.
Yep, completely different strategies.
It's like a labor union where half the members want to negotiate a 5% raise, and the other half want to lock the doors and seize the factory. That tension is unsustainable, and it inevitably causes the Congress to fracture and split in 1907.
With the Congress divided, the political momentum stalls momentarily. But then, an external shock radically alters the landscape. The First World War.
Right, a global catalyst.
The British drag India into the conflict, and the economic strain on the Indian population becomes catastrophic. Defense expenditure skyrockets, and to pay for it, the colonial government doubles taxes on individual incomes and business profits. Prices for basic necessities just surge.
Add forced recruitment of Indian soldiers to fight a European war into that mix, and you have a deeply resentful, desperate, and radicalized peasant class. The powder keg is completely full, and right at this critical juncture, in 1915, a lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi returns to India from South Africa.
Gandhi's entry is a really fascinating study in political patience. When he arrives, his political mentor, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, advises him to keep his mouth shut for a year.
Just listen and observe.
Exactly. Gandhi spends that year traveling third class on trains across the vast Indian landscape. He realized that the early Congress leaders, debating in English in town halls, had zero connection to the agrarian masses.
They were in a bubble.
Yeah. To lead a mass movement, you have to truly understand the lived reality of the people in the villages.
Now, I want to push back heavily on a narrative that is often taught in simplified histories, where Gandhi just walked into the country, gave a speech, and was naturally accepted by the masses as their savior.
Oh, it definitely didn't happen like that.
He didn't just walk in and take over. He engaged in a brilliant, deliberate rebranding. He had to completely shed his identity as a London-trained, suit-wearing lawyer. He shaved his head, abandoned Western clothing, and put on a simple, hand-spun dhoti to physically, visibly prove he was one of the people.
That transformation was essential. By living in a self-sustained ashram, speaking their language, and adopting their ascetic lifestyle, he shattered the barrier between the political elite and the common folk.
He became relatable.
More than relatable, they saw him not as a politician, but as a moral leader, which is why they began venerating him as Mahatma, or Great Soul.
And the masses were primed for a leader who understood them because the colonial state was really tightening its grip. To suppress the growing unrest fueled by the war's economic fallout, the British passed the Rowlatt Act in 1919.
The mechanism of the Rowlatt Act is what makes it so terrifying. It allowed the British colonial government to arrest anyone they suspected of treason and imprison them for up to 2 years without a trial.
That's insane.
No lawyers, no juries, just indefinite detention. It was the ultimate suspension of civil liberties.
Gandhi responds by organizing the Rowlatt Satyagraha, which is effectively the first truly all-India struggle. Shops shut down, schools close, the streets empty out in a massive coordinated strike. But this peaceful resistance meets a horrifying, bloody climax in April 1919 in the city of Amritsar.
We are talking about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. The emotional weight and the intergenerational trauma of this event simply cannot be overstated. A massive crowd of unarmed, peaceful men, women, and children had gathered in an enclosed public garden to celebrate a spring festival and peacefully protest the arrest of local leaders.
The geography of Jallianwala Bagh is the key to understanding the horror of this. It was surrounded by high walls with only one narrow entrance. And a British officer, Brigadier Dyer, he just marched his troops into that narrow entrance, blocking the only exit, and ordered them to open fire on the trapped crowd without a single warning.
They fired over 1,000 rounds, stopping only when they literally ran out of ammunition. Over 400 people were slaughtered, and thousands more were wounded. People were jumping into the garden's well just to escape the bullets.
It is sickening to even visualize. The absolute cold-blooded betrayal of that moment. It instantly shattered any remaining illusion that the British Empire was a civilized, benevolent force. The moderates' belief in British justice died on the ground in Jallianwala Bagh.
That trauma was the catalyst that forced the movement entirely out of the debate halls and irreversibly into the streets. It fueled the massive non-cooperation movement of 1921. And Gandhi made a brilliant strategic move here by merging this outrage with the Khilafat movement.
Let's explain the Khilafat connection, because on the surface it seems unrelated to Indian independence, right?
Right, it requires some context.
Following World War I, the British were dismantling the Ottoman Empire, which threatened the position of the Ottoman Sultan. He was considered the caliph, or spiritual leader, by many Muslims worldwide, including in India.
Gandhi recognized a profound anti-colonial overlap there. By actively supporting the Muslim community's grievance against the British over the Khilafat issue, he successfully united India's two major religious communities.
Hindus and Muslims.
Yes. Hindus enraged by the Punjab massacres and Muslims enraged by the treatment of the Caliphate brought together into a single unified front against the British Raj. Students walked out of government schools, lawyers abandoned the colonial courts, and people lit massive bonfires of foreign cloth.
It was mass mobilization on a scale the British had never seen. But I mean, imagine for a moment you were leading this movement. Think about how hard it is to organize a group chat of 10 friends today with instant messaging.
It's impossible.
Right. So how do you sustain a coordinated political movement of hundreds of millions of people, many of whom are illiterate peasants, spread across thousands of disconnected villages with no modern communication?
You cannot just send them a newsletter or a political manifesto. You need something they can see, touch, and replicate. You need universally understood symbols. And this brings us to a deep analysis of two of the most powerful political symbols in modern history, the charkha, or the spinning wheel, and salt.
Let's look at the charkha first. Mahatma Gandhi, spending a part of each day spinning his own yarn, wasn't just some quaint meditative hobby, was it? It was a fiercely socio-political statement.
Completely. First, it was a rejection of the modern industrial age, which Gandhi felt alienated humans and displaced local labor to enrich foreign capitalists. But more profoundly, the act of spinning allowed Gandhi to attack the very foundations of the traditional Indian caste system
Yeah, that's interesting. How does a spinning wheel break down caste?
by mandating manual labor for everyone. In the rigid social hierarchy, manual labor was designated for the lower castes, while the upper castes engaged in mental or administrative labor.
I see.
By insisting that everyone, regardless of their wealth, education, or caste standing, sit on the floor and engage in the physical manual labor of spinning cloth, Gandhi was actively dissolving the boundaries between the elites and the masses. He was trying to forge a unified, egalitarian society from the ground up.
Which is an incredible sociological tool. But if the charkha was a slow, steady builder of unity, his next symbol was an absolute lightning strike. The Salt March in 1930.
Oh, yes.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Choosing salt was a masterstroke of political theater. Salt is basically the Wi-Fi or the water of the 1930s. It's so fundamental to literal human survival that slapping a massive colonial tax on it offends absolutely everyone, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest farmer. It's the ultimate universal symbol of British absurdity and greed.
It perfectly exposed the sheer exploitation of the colonial state. In March 1930, Gandhi and a group of followers walked 240 miles to the coastal town of Dandi. The global press, including magazines like Time, followed his every step, turning him into a global phenomenon.
And what did they do when they reached the ocean?
They didn't bomb a government building. They didn't stage a violent coup. Gandhi simply bent down, scooped up a handful of saline mud, and boiled seawater to make salt.
By doing something as deeply mundane as boiling seawater, he was openly breaking British law and inviting the entire nation to do the same. And the sources highlight a really crucial detail here, the role of Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay.
Yes, her contribution is monumental.
She was a fierce socialist activist who explicitly intercepted Gandhi and persuaded him not to restrict the salt protests to men alone.
Her intervention changed the course of the movement entirely. It brought women out of their homes and into the political sphere in massive numbers, giving the national struggle an immense, unstoppable new force. Women from both highly conservative and liberal backgrounds marched to the beaches, made salt, and willingly courted arrest.
Just flooding the system.
Right. When the British filled the jails with thousands of women, they realized they were losing not just the practical ability to rule, but their moral mandate on the global stage.
But we have to acknowledge that Gandhi's strict path of ahimsa, or nonviolence, was not universally accepted, and he policed it rigidly.
He was uncompromising on that.
In 1922, during the height of the non-cooperation movement, a mob in a town called Charichara clashed with police, ultimately burning a police station and killing 22 officers. The moment violence occurred, Gandhi abruptly called off the entire national movement. He refused to compromise his principles. But pulling the emergency brake like that left a massive vacuum of frustrated youth.
A vacuum that a new generation of revolutionary nationalists was very eager to fill. The sources make it clear that there was a powerful parallel track to the freedom struggle that entirely rejected nonviolence. In 1928, you have figures like Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, and Sukhdev forming the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, or the HSRA.
Their vision was radically different. They didn't just want to swap white British rulers for brown Indian rulers. They wanted a complete systemic overhaul, fighting all rich exploiting classes through a revolution of workers and peasants.
And later, you have the incredible trajectory of Subhas Chandra Bose. The ideological friction here is fascinating because Bose deeply respected Gandhi. He is actually the one who first broadcast the title Father of the Nation for Gandhi over the radio.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yet Bose fundamentally disagreed with the limitation of ahimsa. When World War II broke out, Bose saw Britain's difficulty as India's opportunity. In 1941, he secretly escaped house arrest in Calcutta, made a perilous journey through Afghanistan to Germany, and eventually traveled by submarine to Southeast Asia.
A submarine?
Yes, all to raise the Azad Hind Fauj, or the Indian National Army.
He literally raised a military force comprised of Indian prisoners of war and expatriates to march on India and fight the British militarily.
Yeah.
And all of this external military pressure is happening, while the internal pressure inside India reaches an absolute boiling point with the 1942 Quit India movement.
The Quit India movement was the final desperate push. Gandhi issued the famous UPSC keyword rallying cry, "Do or die."
Do or die.
He told the masses to consider themselves independent from that very moment. The British response was swift and unimaginably brutal. The sources note that by the end of 1943, over 90,000 people were arrested.
And it wasn't just arrests. When the people set up parallel governments in districts like Satara and Medinipur, tearing up railway tracks and cutting telegraph wires, the colonial government retaliated with military force, and in some areas actually giving orders to machine gun protesting crowds from airplanes. The empire was terrified.
Yeah, so we have to synthesize these forces. Did the British eventually leave because of the moral economic pressure of the spinning wheel and boycotts, or because they were terrified of an armed revolution from the INA and underground resistance?
I would argue it's the synergistic effect of both. The nonviolent mass movements, the Salt March, the civil disobedience stripped the British Empire of its economic profitability and completely humiliated them on the world stage. But the presence of radical revolutionaries, the INA military threat at the borders, and the absolute breakdown of civil order during Quit India proved to the British that they could no longer physically, militarily hold the country by force. The colonial machinery was broken from all sides.
This relentless multi-front pressure finally broke the will of the colonizer. By 1945, exhausted by World War II and facing a mutinous Indian Navy, a new government in Britain committed to granting independence. But this final victory was accompanied by what is undoubtedly the darkest chapter in the subcontinent's history.
The road to 1947 was paved with extreme, toxic political polarization. Back in 1940, the Muslim League had moved a resolution demanding independent status for Muslims. By the time the crucial 1946 elections rolled around, the electorate was starkly divided.
The Congress dominated the general constituencies, but the Muslim League swept the seats specifically reserved for Muslims. That political deadlock rapidly spilled over into unimaginable communal violence. The sources detail the Great Calcutta Killings of August 1946, a massacre that lasted days and left thousands dead in the streets.
It's just devastating.
And the violence didn't stop there. It spread like a virus to Bihar, to the United Provinces, and to the Punjab.
Which brings us to the visceral, jarring, emotional whiplash of August 15th, 1947. On one hand, you have the realization of a decades-long dream, an outburst of immense joy, hope, and sovereign freedom as the British flag comes down. But simultaneously, that joy is immediately crushed by the brutal reality of partition.
The British essentially handed a lawyer, who had barely spent any time in India, a map, and told him to draw a border dividing the country into India and Pakistan based on religious majority lines.
It is hard to fathom the psychological toll of that moment. It's like fighting your entire life to win back your stolen family home, only to have it violently torn in half with a chainsaw the exact day you are finally handed the keys.
The logistical nightmare and the human tragedy were unprecedented. Millions of people suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of a newly drawn border. They were forced to flee overnight, facing untold brutalities. Hindus and Sikhs fleeing on foot in packed trains toward India, Muslims fleeing toward Pakistan.
They were just uprooted.
Completely torn asunder from their ancestral homelands and reduced to refugees in what felt like alien lands. Hundreds of thousands were slaughtered in the migration.
The birth of two independent nations was baptized in an unprecedented communal tragedy, and that communal hatred ultimately claimed the life of the movement's architect. In early 1948, Mahatma Gandhi, who had spent Independence Day fasting and pleading for peace in riot-torn areas, was assassinated.
Such a tragic irony.
A really tragic punctuation mark on a movement that championed nonviolence. We have to treat this era with immense gravity because the trauma of that division still echoes in the geopolitics of the region today.
If we synthesize this entire journey we've taken today, what stands out is the sheer scale of the achievement, despite the horrific cost. Gandhi successfully constructed a true mass movement. He took highly complex economic grievances, like Nehruji's drain of wealth, and translated them into universally understood symbols like the charkha and salt.
He made it accessible.
Exactly. He forged an unprecedented cross-caste and cross-class unity. And when you complement that slow-burning mass mobilization with the fierce, acute pressure applied by radicals like Bose and Bhagat Singh, you get a pressure cooker that successfully dismantled the foundation of the world's most powerful empire.
They didn't just win a political debate, they made the subcontinent ungovernable for the colonizer. And yet the end of the movement was just the beginning of a whole new, impossible challenge.
Exactly, and that leads to a fascinating point to leave our listeners with today. The sources mention that under the Government of India Act of 1935, which was the last major political framework enacted by the colonial government, only 10 to 15% of the adult population in India actually had voting rights.
Wait, really? Just 10 to 15%?
Yeah. There was no universal adult franchise. It was heavily restricted by property, tax, and education qualifications.
So here's the massive question you have to ask yourself. How on earth does a newly independent, deeply traumatized, violently divided, and largely impoverished nation take that heavily restricted elitist system and somehow attempt to forge the world's largest universal democracy?
It's a huge leap.
Right. How do you take a society fractured by partition, dealing with millions of refugees, and decide to grant every single adult the right to vote on day one? That is a monumental, awe-inspiring challenge to mull over until our next deep dive. Welcome to the Deep Dive. So today we are looking at something that, honestly, is going to change how you see your own childhood. We're talking about how the innocent-looking classroom you grew up in, the rows of desks, the shrill bells, the standardized exams.
Right.
Yeah, how all of that was originally designed not to enlighten you, but to serve as a very calculated weapon of colonial control.
It really forces us to completely rethink the entire architecture of learning. Because, we tend to assume that standard schooling is just a natural law, right? Like it's just the way things have always been done.
Yeah, like it's just the default.
Exactly. But when you look at 18th and 19th century colonial India, which is our focus today, you realize that curriculum is always about shaping society. It's about who gets to control the narrative, the economy, and really the very identity of an entire civilization.
It's heavy stuff. So if you've ever wondered where the underlying machinery of your education actually came from, prepare to look at your old school days in a very different light. Our mission for this deep dive is tracing this incredible evolution in India based on the historical sources we have.
And it is a fascinating evolution.
It really is. We are going to explore how the British presence shifted from this initial, almost obsessive fascination with ancient Indian texts to a full-blown ideological war over what it actually means to be, quote-unquote, educated.
Yeah, and to understand that shift, we really have to look at the mechanics of empire. Education wasn't just some side project for the British. It was the central engine for how they planned to manage and ultimately transform the Indian subcontinent.
Well, let's start with that initial phase then, because it completely defies the typical cartoon villain image of colonization that you might expect.
Right, it really does.
Because before the British started forcing English down everyone's throats, there were these thinkers in the late 1700s known as the Orientalists, and they were obsessed with mastering India's ancient knowledge.
They absolutely were.
You have William Jones arriving in Calcutta in 1783 as a junior judge, and this guy was a massive linguist. He already knew Greek, Latin, French, English, Arabic, and Persian before he even stepped off the boat.
And once Jones arrived, he became totally captivated by ancient Indian texts on law, philosophy, religion, and science.
Wow.
Yeah, he, along with other British scholars like Henry Thomas Colebrook and Nathaniel Hallhead, they didn't want to erase Indian culture. They actually wanted to study it. They established the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784, and they even started publishing a journal called Asiatic Researches.
And they put real money behind this too, right? Because the British set up the Calcutta Madrasa in 1781 specifically to promote the study of Arabic, Persian, and Islamic law.
Yes, exactly.
And then, a decade later, in 1791, they established the Hindu College in Benares to focus on ancient Sanskrit texts. The sources suggest these Orientalists actually believed they were helping Indians rediscover their own lost heritage.
That was definitely their stated philosophical approach. The underlying idea for Jones and Colebrook was that to truly understand India and to plan its future development, they had to discover the sacred and legal texts of the past.
Right.
They felt that bringing these ancient texts back to light would act as a civilizing mission, but one that was actually rooted in India's own traditions.
Okay, wait, hold on. Because you're telling me an occupying military and economic power just wanted to act as benevolent historians. I am not really buying it. What was their actual angle here?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. I mean, let's look at that famous monument to Warren Hastings, the Governor General, who heavily backed this whole movement. In the monument, he is standing there majestically, flanked by a Hindu pandit on one side and a Muslim munshi on the other.
It's quite the visual.
It is. But that doesn't scream academic curiosity to me. That screams calculated optics. So was this genuine respect, or was it just a strategy to win hearts, learn the vernacular, and rule the local population more efficiently?
Well, it is the crucial tension of the era, and the reality definitely leans heavily toward the pragmatic.
Yeah.
Because on a systemic level, Hastings and the colonial administration literally needed Indian scholars.
Oh, to actually run the place.
Exactly. The
Right.
British could not effectively administer justice if they didn't understand the Dharmashastras or Islamic law. They needed local pandits and munshis to interpret these ancient texts so the British could navigate local customs without sparking a massive, nationwide revolt.
See, it was really about mitigating risk.
Precisely. They explicitly felt that to remove the stigma of quote-unquote alien rule, they needed to patronize the subjects the locals already treasured.
That makes a lot of sense.
So while individuals like William Jones may have had a profound, genuine academic curiosity, that curiosity was ultimately weaponized as a pragmatic tool for colonial administration.
So this pragmatic respect obviously didn't last, because as we move into the early 19th century, a new group of British administrators rolls in, and they basically decide this entire Orientalist project is a complete waste of time.
Right, it is an intellectually violent paradigm shift. These new thinkers were known as the Anglicists, and they looked at the millions of rupees spent on Sanskrit and Arabic with just absolute disdain.
Total 180.
Yeah. Thinkers like James Mill argued that the aim of education shouldn't be about rediscovering lost Eastern glories. It should be about teaching what is useful and practical.
Useful for whom, though? Like, useful for a human being or useful for an empire?
Useful for modernizing the colony, along European lines, of course.
Yeah.
They argued that Eastern literature was unscientific, full of errors, and fundamentally unserious.
Wow.
And this ideological attack gets incredibly sharp in the 1830s with the arrival of Thomas Babington Macaulay.
Oh, Macaulay. I have to bring up his quote from the sources because it is wild. Macaulay basically gave a one-star Yelp review to thousands of years of human civilization without even learning to read the menu.
He really did.
He actually declared on the official record that, and I quote, "A single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia."
It is a breathtakingly arrogant statement.
Like, insane.
But the terrifying thing is, it wasn't just an opinion. It became the legal foundation of an empire.
Right.
Macaulay's ideology culminated in his famous Minute on Indian Education in 1835, which directly led to the English Education Act. The decree dictated that English would be the sole medium of instruction for higher education, and state funding for Oriental learning was just immediately slashed.
It's like salting the earth of an entire civilization's intellectual soil just so nothing indigenous can ever grow there again.
That's a great way to put it.
What is the psychological mechanism of that, though? To suddenly have the ruling class legally decree that centuries of your local knowledge, your poetry, your science is officially worthless.
The psychological impact creates a multi-generational fracture. I mean, think about it. When the state dictates that the language of power, success, and intellect is inherently foreign, it immediately alienates the population from their own heritage.
Right, you're a stranger in your own house.
Exactly. It engineers a hierarchy of knowledge where indigenous thought is relegated to the very bottom. You're essentially telling an entire populace that to be civilized, to be modern, they must stop being themselves and basically mimic their colonizers.
So Macaulay wipes out the cultural curriculum. But you cannot run a massive industrialized empire on ideology alone, right? You need a bureaucratic machine.
Yes, you do.
And that is exactly what the British engineered next.
Which brings us to Charles Wood's dispatch of 1854. If Macaulay provided the ideological disdain, Wood provided the systemic blueprint.
Okay.
This document marked the absolute triumph of European learning over Oriental knowledge. But what makes Wood's dispatch so revealing is how nakedly it outlines the economic motives of this new education system.
Yeah, the sources outline this perfectly. The dispatch explicitly argued that introducing Indians to European ways of life would change their tastes and desires. It was literally designed to create a demand for British goods.
Exactly. To understand the mechanism here, you have to look at what was happening in Britain. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Britain was mass-producing goods at an unprecedented scale.
So they needed a market.
They desperately needed India to be a consumer market, not just a supplier of raw materials. So education became a tool for consumer conditioning. If you teach a generation to admire Western culture, they will instinctively buy Western clothes, Western furniture, and Western tea.
The dispatch didn't just stop at economics, though. It argued for what they called moral benefits. It claimed that European learning would make Indians truthful and honest.
Right, quote-unquote honest.
Yeah, which, reading between the lines, is just bureaucratic code for creating dependable civil servants. It reads like a corporate training manual designed to manufacture compliant middle management.
That's exactly what it was. They needed a massive bureaucracy to extract revenue and run the colony, and importing clerks from London was way too expensive.
Obviously.
So they engineered a localized workforce that was loyal to the British Crown. Following the dispatch, they established universities in Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay in 1857, specifically to churn out these administrators.
Okay, but let's talk about the collateral damage of this corporate machine, specifically the local schools, because the sources highlight this really fascinating investigation by a Scottish missionary named William Adam.
Yes, William Adams' report.
In the 1830s, he toured Bengal and Bihar and reported back on the state of vernacular education. What did he actually find? Because it completely flips the narrative of an uneducated India.
Adams' report is astonishing. He found over 100,000 pathshalas, which are local village schools, scattered across Bengal and Bihar.
Wait, 100,000?
100,000. They were small, usually with no more than 20 students each, but collectively they were educating millions of children from all backgrounds.
That implies a highly functioning, decentralized educational network. How did these local pathshalas operate compared to the rigid British model?
They operated on complete flexibility.
Yeah.
There were no fixed fees, no printed books, no separate school buildings, and no rigid annual exams. Classes were often just held under a banyan tree or in a village shop.
Wow, so very organic.
Very organic.
Yeah.
And most importantly, the guru dictated the fee based on the income of the parents. The rich paid more, the poor paid less, and everything was taught orally based on the students' immediate needs.
So how did the British manage to destroy a network of 100,000 schools? That seems like it would take a lot of effort.
It happened through the mechanical imposition of rigid standardization. Post-1854, the British decided to, quote-unquote, improve these vernacular schools by enforcing a strict routine.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. They introduced fixed fees, regular printed exams, and mandatory daily attendance.
Which completely ignores the reality of agrarian life.
That is the crucial mechanism of exclusion right there. In the traditional system, classes simply stopped during harvest time because peasant children had to work in the fields.
Right. They had to help their families survive.
But the new British system demanded rigid attendance regardless of the agricultural cycle. If a peasant child missed school to harvest crops, it was marked as indiscipline.
Oh, that is so calculated. So the system literally just mechanically prices out the agrarian poor.
Yes.
It transforms education from a flexible, community-based practice into an exclusive luxury for those who could afford the fixed fees and the time away from work.
Exactly. The peasantry was structurally left behind. And a new English-speaking elite was created, which drastically widened the divide within Indian society.
But Indian intellectuals did not just take this lying down. As this corporate colonial manual took hold, a fierce debate erupted among Indians about how to fight back.
Right.
If the British were engineering loyal clerks, how did Indian leaders envision national education?
Well, the responses were incredibly varied. Some believed Western education was actually essential to modernize India and keep pace with global advancements. But others sought to actively reclaim their roots and decolonize the Indian mind.
Enter Sri Aurobindo Ghosh. In a speech in Bombay in 1908, he lays out this really pragmatic vision. He argues that the primary goal of education shouldn't be to create clerks, but to awaken the spirit of nationality.
Aurobindo serves as a really fascinating bridge in this era. He saw the psychological damage of the colonial system, but he didn't just reject modernization outright.
Right.
He argued forcefully for using vernacular languages, the languages the people actually spoke, so education could reach the masses, totally bypassing the English gatekeepers.
He also wanted students to learn useful crafts, to build economic independence, but he made it very clear from the sources that Indians should still take full advantage of modern scientific discoveries and Western democratic experiments.
His pragmatism is key here. He is essentially saying, let us root ourselves deeply in our own culture and history. Let us draw strength from our ancestors, but, and this is important, let us not ignore the tools of the modern world.
So a balanced approach.
Yeah, he wanted to harmonize a traditional Indian identity with the harsh, practical necessities of a globalizing world.
Aurobindo wanted a pragmatic blend. But did anyone look at this British system and say, we need to burn this down and build a fortress against it?
That brings us to Mahatma Gandhi.
Ah.
His critique of colonial education was absolute and blistering. Gandhi believed it was literally sinful because it enslaved the minds of Indians, manufacturing a deep-seated inferiority complex about their own culture.
He noted that English education made Indians strangers in their own lands, which honestly makes perfect sense. If you only speak a foreign tongue and you are conditioned to despise your local culture, you lose all ability to relate to or lead the masses.
Gandhi drew a really brilliant distinction between being literate and being educated.
Okay, unpack that.
He argued that the British system just made people literate. It just taught them to read and write to serve a bureaucracy. True education, to him, was the all-around drawing out of the best in a person, body, mind, and spirit.
I keep seeing this term in his writings. Swaraj. True freedom. But what did that actually mean mechanically for a student sitting in a classroom?
Well, Swaraj translates to self-rule, but for Gandhi, it meant much more than just political independence from Britain. It meant profound self-restraint and total self-reliance at the individual and village level. Mechanically, this meant education had to start with a useful handicraft, like spinning or weaving.
He wanted them to produce actual things, to understand the why and wherefore of every process rather than just rudely memorizing dates from a textbook.
Yes, but there was an even deeper philosophical rejection happening there. Gandhi was highly suspicious of Western civilization's obsession with machines and technology. Oh, absolutely. He viewed modern machinery and mass industrialization as fundamentally dehumanizing. To achieve Swaraj, education had to be grounded in manual labor and spiritual development, deliberately kept far away from the corrupting influence of the mechanized West.
So if Gandhi's answer was to build a wall against the modern world and return to the spinning wheel, did anyone argue the exact opposite? Was there a way to fight the British without rejecting modernization entirely?
There was, and it was championed by Rabindranath Tagore.
Tagore's origin story is fascinating. As a child, he absolutely despised going to school. He found the rigid, four-walled classroom completely suffocating. He actually described it as feeling like a prison.
And that childhood trauma profoundly shaped his entire philosophy. He believed that the restrictive discipline of the British schooling system actively killed a child's natural desire to be creative. It just crushed their innate sense of wonder.
So in 1901, he took action. He went out into a rural setting about 100 kilometers away from Calcutta and founded Santiniketan, which means the abode of peace. He basically built an open garden without fences.
At Santiniketan, classes were often held outdoors, under the trees. Learning was encouraged within a natural environment. Teachers were instructed to be imaginative, to deeply understand the child's mind, rather than just lecture them from a podium.
Okay, here is the critical distinction between Gandhi and Tagore, specifically regarding modern technology. We established Gandhi is suspicious of the machine. Where does Tagore stand?
Tagore was a universalist. While he vehemently opposed the rote memorization and cultural erasure of Western colonial education, he did not reject Western science or the machine.
Oh, interesting.
In fact, he believed the only way forward was to combine the absolute best of Indian tradition, its art, music, and dance, with modern Western science and technology.
Let's put their philosophies head to head for a second. Gandhi wants to decolonize the mind by returning to the spinning wheel, rejecting mass industrialization to save the soul of the village.
Right.
But Tagore wants to decolonize the mind by unleashing boundless creativity, blending ancient art with modern science to create a complete global citizen.
It's a brilliant contrast. Both recognized that the British education system was a weapon of subjugation. Both sought to free the Indian mind, but they saw fundamentally different vehicles for that freedom. Gandhi saw it in spiritual and economic self-sufficiency, walling off the corrupting influences. Tagore saw it in borderless intellectual exploration, integrating with the broader world on an equal footing.
The sheer scale of this historical debate is just incredible. I mean, we started with the British arriving with a so-called civilizing mission. We watched William Jones and the Orientalists try to study ancient texts, utilizing academic curiosity as a tool to administer laws.
Then we saw Macaulay and the Anglicists aggressively dismantle that approach, imposing English to erase what they basically deemed a backward culture.
And then Wood's Dispatch turns that ideological disdain into a sprawling corporate machine. They mandate fixed fees and strict attendance, which mechanically destroys the 100,000 flexible pathshalas, pricing the agrarian poor right out of an education while creating loyal clerks and eager consumers.
And finally, we witnessed the powerful philosophical counter-movements. Aurobindo's pragmatism, Gandhi's call for profound self-reliance, and Tagore's visionary synthesis of nature, art, and science.
When we strip away all the historical dates and figures, what is the ultimate takeaway here for you as an academician?
The history of this era proves one undeniable truth. Education is never merely the transfer of neutral information.
Never.
It is fundamentally a mechanism of power. In the hands of a colonizer, it is a tool for control, economic exploitation, and the erasure of heritage. But in the hands of a people, as envisioned by leaders like Gandhi and Tagore, it is the ultimate tool for building self-respect and forging a true, independent national identity.
I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder as you go about your day. We spent a lot of time today discussing how the 19th century education system was deliberately blueprinted to create compliant, rote-memorizing clerks and predictable consumers.
We did.
Well, today, we stand on the edge of a massive technological revolution where artificial intelligence is increasingly taking over all of that rote clerk work. So if the modern systems we still sit in were built to manufacture 19th century administrators, what happens to a generation trained for compliance in a world that suddenly only values original thought? Are our schools still churning out parts for a factory that no longer exists?
That is a question that demands an entirely new blueprint.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep diving deep.
Imagine being locked in a room, right? And you're given less than 2 years to write the rules of survival for, well, hundreds of millions of people.
Oh, and don't forget the context.
Right, exactly. While you are trying to write those rules, the country outside your window is literally tearing itself apart in just unprecedented communal violence.
Yeah.
And that wasn't a hypothetical exercise. That was the winter of 1946 in the Constituent Assembly of India.
It is. I mean, it's the absolute definition of a historical crucible. We always sort of look back at constitution making as this polite, dusty legal drafting process carried out by men in formal wear.
Yeah, a very sanitized version of history.
Exactly. But when you look at the primary sources from 1946, you realize this was a fierce, incredibly high-stakes arena. The very soul of a massive, diverse subcontinent was literally being fought over.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We're taking a really close look at the historical sources, specifically Chapter 8, Framing the Constitution.
Right.
We are going to step right inside that Constituent Assembly and examine the ideological collisions, the brilliant personalities, and, well, the monumental compromises that forged the longest written constitution in the world.
It's an amazing journey.
It really is. But before we get into the actual debates, we need to establish who was even in this room, because the makeup of the assembly itself is, it's just full of contradictions.
Oh, it really is. So the Constituent Assembly was formed in 1946 under a framework called the Cabinet Mission, which was essentially a plan formulated by the British government to discuss and facilitate the transfer of power. And there were 389 members in total. But the critical detail, the one that often gets overlooked, is how they actually got there. They were not elected by the general public.
Wait, hold on. They weren't elected by the people. Then how did they even get the authority to write the Constitution?
So out of the 389 members, 292 were indirectly elected by the members of the existing provincial legislatures. And another 93 were nominated by the heads of the princely states, which were these semi-autonomous regions still ruled by local monarchs, and 4 came from chief commissioner provinces.
Oh, okay.
So it was an indirectly elected body, heavily restricted by, property and educational qualifications that existed under British rule.
That creates a massive paradox, doesn't it? I mean, you have a body that was not elected by universal adult franchise, meaning not every adult citizen got a vote to put them there.
Exactly.
Yet one of the very first and most profound achievements of this assembly was to grant universal adult franchise to the citizens of the newly independent nation, like immediately.
And We really cannot overstate how revolutionary that decision was. To understand the magnitude, you have to look at the established democracies of the time.
Right, older ones.
The Western model of democracy was deeply, deeply incremental. In the United Kingdom or the U.S., voting was initially restricted to men who own property. Then, decades later, maybe men with a certain level of education. It took long, bitter, and often violent struggles for working-class men to get a voice, and an agonizingly long generational fight for women to be granted that same right.
It was always treated as a privilege you had to earn.
Yes, exactly.
But the Indian Constituent Assembly looked at this vast population where a massive majority was unlettered and living in deep poverty, and essentially said political equality is a fundamental human right.
Right. It's not a reward for passing an education or wealth test.
But how did this elite, indirectly elected group convince themselves to just hand over total political power to the masses instantly?
Well, they realized that the freedom struggle itself had been a mass movement. You couldn't ask millions of ordinary people to sacrifice everything to overthrow an empire and then tell them, oh, sorry, you aren't qualified to vote in the country you just helped build.
Yeah, that would be completely hypocritical.
Exactly. They trusted the people implicitly. They believed that democratic participation would be the very mechanism that educated the masses.
Okay, let's look at the political makeup of this bold assembly, because I found a statistic in the sources that made me pause. The Muslim League chose to boycott the assembly initially.
Right. They didn't join it first.
And the socialists were unwilling to join because they saw the whole setup as a British creation. So you end up with a room where 82% of the members belong to a single political party, the Indian National Congress.
Yes.
Hold on. If 82% of the room belongs to a single party, how is this not just a giant echo chamber? That sounds like a rubber stamp committee, not a diverse democratic assembly.
On paper, it absolutely looks like a monopoly, but the reality was that the Congress Party at that time was not a monolith. It didn't have a single unified ideology.
What was it then?
It functioned much more like a massive umbrella organization. So within that 82%, you had members who were staunch defenders of elite landlordism, sitting just a few seats away from radical socialists demanding total wealth redistribution.
Oh, wow. So the friction was happening entirely in-house.
Yeah. Exactly. You had assertively secular voices having to negotiate with deeply conservative religious factions.
Fascinating.
The sources highlight a really brilliant observation by Frank Anthony, an Anglo-Indian member. He noted that some individuals were technically members of the Congress Party, but ideologically they were spiritually aligned with the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha,
Which were right-wing Hindu nationalist organizations.
Exactly. The ideological spectrum in that one room was staggeringly wide.
It's like an orchestra, where the brass section wants to play classical, the strings want to play jazz, and the percussion is doing heavy metal.
That's a perfect analogy.
You can't just tell them to play louder to drown each other out. You need someone to write a completely new sheet of music where both sections feel like they are playing their preferred genre.
So who are the conductors managing all this chaos?
Well, they had some of the most remarkable minds of the 20th century stepping into those roles. Let's start with Jawaharlal Nehru.
On December 13th, 1946, he moved what was called the Objectives Resolution. This was essentially the philosophical North Star for the entire Constitution.
What did he actually say?
Nehru brilliantly fused the liberal ideas of political democracy, invoking the American and French revolutions, with the socialist idea of economic justice, and he tailored it all specifically for the unique Indian context.
So Nehru provided the vision. But a vision needs an architect to build the actual structure. And that brings us to Dr. B.R. Ambedkar.
Oh, absolutely. The chairman of the drafting committee and just an unmatched legal expert.
His role was paramount. But we also have to dive into how the machinery of the assembly actually functioned, which brings us to the unsung heroes behind the scenes.
Yes, people like B.N. Rao, the constitutional advisor.
I want to spend a second on B.N. Rao, because he wasn't just sitting in an office writing opinions. How did he actually do his job?
Rao essentially conducted massive global reconnaissance. I mean, he traveled to the U.S., the U.K., Ireland, Canada.
Just studying how everyone else did it.
Exactly. He met with foreign judges and constitutional experts. He compiled exhaustive comparative studies of global political systems. He analyzed what failed in other democracies and what succeeded.
Wow.
He created these incredibly detailed background papers, so the assembly wasn't just debating in a vacuum.
And then you have S.N. Mukherjee, the chief draftsman. This goes back to our orchestra analogy. When two wildly different ideological factions finally reached a vague conceptual agreement, how did that actually become law?
Right.
S.N. Mukherjee was the one writing that new sheet of music. He had this unparalleled ability to take sprawling, abstract philosophical compromises and translate them into clear, binding, ironclad legal phrasing.
It's a rare skill.
Yeah.
Without Mukherjee's specific talent for legal translation, the Constitution would have just remained a collection of noble but totally unenforceable ideas.
Okay, so they have the architects, they had the vision, but almost immediately they run into their first explosive hurdle.
Yeah.
And this wasn't a debate about abstract philosophy, you know. This was about survival, identity, and representation.
Yes, the minority question.
All right, they had to figure out how to protect minority communities. This brings up the massive debate over separate electorates. But wait, before we get to the arguments, let's make sure we're clear on the mechanics here. When the Assembly talks about a separate electorate, how does that actually work at the ballot box?
Yeah.
Are we talking about literal separate voting systems for different religions?
Yes, essentially. In a separate electorate system, voters of a specific religious community vote only for candidates of that same community.
So it's completely siloed.
Exactly. If you are a Muslim voter, you are registered on a separate list, and you
Right.
only vote for a Muslim candidate. Hindus only vote for Hindus, and so on. The British had introduced this system years earlier.
Okay, so with that mechanical understanding, let's look at the clash on the Assembly floor, because it was intense.
Very.
On one side, you have B. Pakr Bahadur from Madras making this incredibly powerful plea to keep separate electorates. He argued that minorities exist everywhere, and you can't just wish them away. For a nation to live in harmony, he felt minorities needed a guaranteed, meaningful voice within the political system.
We really have to unpack the underlying mechanism of his fear here. For Bahadur, a separate electorate wasn't about dividing the nation, it was a protective wall.
A way to survive.
Yes. In a massive country with a clear religious majority, he genuinely believed that if everyone voted in one giant pool, the specific needs, culture, and safety of the Muslim minority would simply be drowned out by the sheer numbers of the non-Muslim majority.
He felt this mechanism was the only way to ensure political survival.
Exactly. And it's a very real fear.
But the pushback against this was fierce. R.V. Dulekar dismissed the demand entirely, calling it an allure to a long lull, basically saying it's a trap.
Yeah.
And then Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel steps in with a monumental rebuttal. He called separate electorates a poison that has entered the body politic.
Patel's perspective was driven by the visceral trauma of what separate electorates had already mechanically done to the social fabric of the subcontinent.
He saw it firsthand.
He viewed it as a deliberate mischief engineered by the British colonizers. The logic of the empire was divide and rule.
Right.
By forcing people to vote only along religious lines, you mechanically force politicians to campaign only on religious issues, which inherently turns one community against another.
Patel actually said, and this is a quote from the sources, "The British element is gone, but they have left the mischief behind. We do not want to perpetuate that mischief."
It's a powerful statement.
He was looking out the window at a country being torn apart by communal violence, and his argument was, the empire used this exact voting mechanism to break us. Why on earth would we build our new republic on that same broken foundation?
And you see, neither Bahadur nor Patel was acting out of malice. Bahadur is arguing that distinct political representation is the only way to ensure safety for a minority.
Yeah.
While Patel is arguing that this exact mechanism fosters separatism and ultimately destroys national unity.
It really forces you, as the listener, to ask a fundamental question about designing a democracy. Do you protect minority communities by giving them their own distinct political walls, ensuring they are always heard from behind those walls?
Or do you force integration by tearing those walls down entirely?
Exactly. Demanding that everyone participates in the exact same political arena, even if the majority has the numerical advantage.
Well, ultimately, the Assembly chose to tear down the walls. They abolished separate electorates. They placed their faith in universal adult franchise and a secular constitutional framework to protect all citizens equally, regardless of religion.
So they've decided who gets to vote, and they've decided how they vote by tearing down these separate religious electorates.
Yeah.
But that creates an immediate power vacuum.
Right. Where does the power go?
If everyone is voting together, who actually holds the immense power of those votes? Is it the local state governments who know the terrain, or a massive central government in the capital?
This was the battle over balancing the scales between the center and the states. To manage this mechanically, the draft constitution created 3 specific lists of subjects: the Union list, the state list and the concurrent list.
Let's define those mechanisms really quickly. The central government had exclusive power over the subjects on the Union list.
Correct.
The states had power over the state list, and the concurrent list was a shared responsibility between the two.
That was the framework, yeah. But the actual distribution of power showed a severe center bias. The central government in Delhi was given exclusive control over crucial economic engines like minerals and key industries.
Wow.
But the most controversial mechanism was Article 356.
Okay, how does Article 356 actually work in practice?
Article 356 gave the center the phenomenal power to essentially dismiss a democratically elected state government.
Just override them entirely?
Yes. If a governor, who, by the way, is appointed by the center, reports that a state's constitutional machinery has failed, the center can invoke this article to step in and take over the state's entire administration directly.
That is a staggering amount of centralized power. And it went beyond administration, right? It was deeply fiscal.
Very much so.
The sources show the center kept the proceeds from major lucrative taxes like customs, duties, and company taxes. So the center gets the massive corporate revenue, and the states are just left scraping by on local land, property, and sales taxes.
Precisely. And this fiscal imbalance terrified representatives like K. Santhanam from Madras. He delivered a grave warning against this centralization.
What did he say?
He argued mechanically that if you overburden the center with too many responsibilities, it is going to collapse under its own weight.
Santhanam's logic was fascinating. He said you actually have to transfer functions to the states to make the center stronger.
Counterintuitive, but it makes sense.
He warned that if you leave the provinces completely impoverished by hoarding all the tax revenue at the center, the states won't be able to function or develop. And an overburdened center combined with impoverished provinces would inevitably lead to a revolt against the center.
It was a prophetic warning about the need for regional autonomy. But we have to ask why the heavyweights of the assembly leaders like Ambedkar, Nehru, and Gopalswamy Iyengar pushed so hard for a powerful center.
Why did they?
You have to look at the historical context. They were drafting this while witnessing the trauma and absolute chaos of partition.
Ah, right, survival mode. Ambedkar flat out declared he wanted a strong and united center, much stronger than what the British had created in 1935.
Yes.
And Balakrishna Sharma laid out the brutal logic. You need a massive central power to mobilize economic resources across a vast, impoverished country to stop communal frenzies and, crucially, to defend the nation against foreign aggression.
Think about it like balancing a massive corporation during a severe economic depression.
Okay.
Do you empower the local branch managers who know the specific terrain of their local markets, hoping they innovate their way out? Or do you consolidate all the power, all the budget, and all the decision-making at headquarters to ensure the whole company survives the storm?
In a crisis, headquarters always consolidates control. And in 1946, the Assembly decided that India was facing an existential crisis. To survive as a unified nation, headquarters, the center, needed the heavy reins.
So the Constitution showed a distinct intentional bias towards the rights of the Union over the constituent states.
Okay, so the power structure is set. The center holds the purse strings and the heavy administrative powers, but then they slam into an issue that is deeply, deeply personal.
Oh, this was explosive.
Imagine waking up tomorrow and being told the language you use to think, dream, and work is no longer valid in a courtroom, a bank, or a government office. What is the literal language in which this newly forged nation will govern itself?
The national language debate, this wasn't just about administrative convenience, you know.
Right.
Language is the DNA of culture and identity, and the historical ground under this debate had been shifting dramatically.
Set the stage for us.
Initially, Mahatma Gandhi had championed a language called Hindustani to be the national language.
What exactly was Hindustani? Because I think a lot of people might not know.
It was a beautiful, organic blend of Hindi and Urdu. It was the language of the streets, accessible to common people across large parts of the country. It naturally absorbed words from regional languages and even foreign ones.
Like a living, breathing dialect.
Exactly. Gandhi saw it as the ultimate unifying force.
But the sources show that dream was entirely derailed by the political climate. How did a unifying language become weaponized?
Well, by the 1940s, language became deeply associated with the politics of religious identity. Hindi and Urdu started being pulled apart mechanically.
How so?
There was a deliberate political movement to Sanskritize Hindi, actively purging it of Persian and Arabic words. Simultaneously, Urdu was being increasingly Persianized.
So by the time we get to the Constituent Assembly floor, the atmosphere is incredibly tense.
Very.
You have R.V. Dulekar making an aggressive push. He didn't just want Hindi as the national language. He demanded it be used as the sole language of constitution-making itself.
And this aggression sparked immense existential fear, particularly in the southern provinces where Hindi was not spoken. Srimati G. Dugabai from Madras took the floor and delivered an urgent warning. She explained that this push for a dominant, highly Sanskritized Hindi was terrifying for the South.
Her fear wasn't just about having to learn a new vocabulary, though.
No, it was much deeper.
It was the mechanical reality that if a dominant Hindi was enforced, it would cut at the very roots of ancient, rich provincial languages like Tamil or Telugu. It felt like cultural erasure disguised as national unity.
Exactly.
If your language isn't the language of power, you become a second-class citizen in your own country.
This was a total deadlock. Emotions were completely raw. It could have easily derailed the entire constitutional process.
It really could have.
But then, the Language Committee manages to thread the needle with what is known as the Munshi Iyengar formula.
How did they actually solve it legally? Because it seems impossible to please everyone here.
It is a masterclass in political de-escalation. The committee decided that Hindi in the Devanagari script would be the official language of India.
Okay.
Not the national language, but the official language.
That is incredible. They changed one single word from national to official. Why does that mechanically solve the problem?
Because words carry weight, you know. National implies cultural supremacy, emotional allegiance, and singularity. Official is purely administrative. It immediately lowers the emotional temperature.
That's brilliant.
Furthermore, they didn't force an overnight change. They mandated a 15-year transition period where English would continue to be used for all official government purposes.
Oh, so it's a structural cooling-off period.
Exactly. And crucially, every province was granted the right to choose one of its own regional languages for official administrative work within its own borders.
That completely validates and protects the linguistic diversity of the states while acknowledging the desire for an indigenous language of central administration. It just gave everyone a chance to breathe.
They preserved unity without enforcing linguistic uniformity.
When you step back and look at the monumental scale of what this assembly achieved, it's just staggering. I mean, in under 2 years, they analyzed global democracies to leapfrog incremental voting rights.
They did.
They navigated the absolute poison of the separate electorates debate to build a secular framework. They walked the tightrope of balancing center and state powers to prevent the country from collapsing.
Yeah.
And they diffused the emotional minefield of the national language with a single word change.
They took a fractured subcontinent and gave it a unified, highly functional, and deeply researched framework. But the most important thing to remember is that the architects of this document were under no illusions about the finality of their work.
And that leads perfectly into a final, really sobering reflection that I want to leave you, the listener, with today. It comes from Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's concluding sentiments to the Assembly.
It's a very famous warning.
Yes. He pointed out something profound about the mechanics of democracy itself. He said that this magnificent document they had just drafted guaranteed political equality. It guaranteed one person, one vote, one value.
But Ambedkar issued a stark warning. He argued that political equality is merely a framework. Unless the nation actively works to achieve social and economic equality, the entire political structure remains a fragile illusion.
It is the ultimate reality check. You can give someone the right to vote, you can tear down separate electorates, you can balance state powers.
Yes.
But if a citizen remains crushed by generational poverty, or if society continues to enforce social discrimination and cast barriers, then that democracy is fundamentally incomplete.
It's a haunting challenge laid down at the very dawn of the Republic. Ambedkar asked us to secure not just a vote, but a truly equal life.
Look around today. Look at the society we live in right now. Has that warning been answered? Keep that question in mind the next time you think of a constitution as just a static, dusty rule book.